In the quiet hours when the world grows still, when the last light fades from the western sky, we find ourselves drawn to the stories that time has left unfinished. The Great War, as it was once called, ended more than a century ago in 1918, yet its shadows still stretch across our understanding of history. What began as a conflict that would supposedly end all wars became something far more complex, far more mysterious than anyone could have imagined. The trenches of the Western Front held secrets that went beyond the horror of battle. Soldiers vanished without explanation, entire battalions disappeared into morning mist, and strange lights danced across no man's land on nights when no artillery fired. Ships carrying precious cargo slipped beneath dark waters, taking their mysteries to the ocean floor. Codes were broken that should have been unbreakable, and truces bloomed in places where only hatred should have grown. These are not the stories you learned in school textbooks. These are the whispered tales that veterans carried home but rarely spoke aloud. They are the files marked classified that gathered dust in government archives for decades. They are the questions that historians still debate in hushed voices, the puzzles that have no clean solutions, the enigmas that make us wonder if we truly understand what happened during those 4 terrible years from 1914 to 1918. Tonight, we embark on a journey through time, following the threads of these unsolved mysteries. We will walk the fog-shrouded battlefields of Gallipoli, sail the treacherous waters of the North Sea, and peer into the smoky back rooms where empires made their secret bargains. Each story we explore reveals how the Great War was not just a conflict between nations, but a collision of old certainties with new realities, where the impossible seemed to happen with startling regularity. Some of these mysteries have found partial answers through decades of patient research. Others remain as puzzling today as they were 100 years ago. All of them remind us that history is not a collection of facts carved in stone, but a living tapestry woven from countless human experiences, many of which defy simple explanation. The Europe of 1914 was a continent balanced on the edge of a knife, where ancient monarchies ruled over rapidly changing societies. Electric lights were beginning to replace gas lamps in the great cities, automobiles shared cobblestone streets with horse-drawn carriages, and the first tentative voices crackled across radio waves. It was a world caught between centuries, where telegraph wires carried messages faster than any horse could run, yet diplomats still conducted their most sensitive negotiations in elegant drawing rooms over brandy and cigars. In this world of shifting loyalties and hidden alliances, ordinary people lived their lives with little understanding of the complex web of treaties and obligations that bound their nations together. A farmer in rural France could not have known that his fate was tied to the political tensions in far-off Bosnia. A shopkeeper in London had no way of imagining that his sons would soon be called to fight in places whose names he could not pronounce. When the spark finally came in Sarajevo on a warm June morning in 1914, few could have predicted the inferno that would follow. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the map of Europe and change the nature of warfare forever. Yet even as the great powers mobilized their armies and the first shots were fired, mysteries began to accumulate like morning fog rolling across a battlefield. As we settle into these tales, let them carry you gently into the realm of wonder and speculation. Picture the gaslit streets of London as strange airships drift silently overhead. Imagine the salt spray of the North Sea as submarines prowl beneath its surface, carrying secrets that may never surface. Feel the damp earth of the Western Front, where soldiers from opposite sides shared cigarettes and sang songs together on one miraculous Christmas night. For in the spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine, the most fascinating truths often lie waiting to be discovered. The Great War may have ended long ago, but its deepest secrets continue to beckon us forward, inviting us to explore the shadows that history has left behind. Tonight, we begin that exploration, one mystery at a time, letting each story unfold like pages from a forgotten diary discovered in an old attic trunk. The summer of 1914 began like any other in the grand capitals of Europe. In Vienna, the Habsburg court maintained its ceremonial elegance, while in Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II reviewed his troops with characteristic theatrical flair. London's financial district hummed with the business of empire, and in Paris the cafes along the boulevards filled with the usual conversations about art, politics, and the season's fashions. Few could have imagined that by August, these same cities would be mobilizing millions of men for a conflict that would consume an entire generation. The assassination that changed everything happened on a street corner in Sarajevo, a city that most Europeans could barely locate on a map. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had come to Bosnia on what should have been a routine ceremonial visit. The morning of June 28th seemed ordinary enough, with the Archduke and his wife Sophie riding in an open car through the city streets, waving to curious onlookers who had gathered to catch a glimpse of royalty. What happened next has been told countless times, yet mysteries still cling to those fateful moments like morning mist. The first assassination attempt failed when a bomb bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded beneath the vehicle behind them. By all logic, the royal couple should have immediately departed for safety. Instead, Franz Ferdinand insisted on visiting the wounded from the first attack in the hospital. It was this unplanned detour that led their driver to take a wrong turn down Franz Joseph Street, where 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip waited with a loaded pistol. The shots that rang out at 10:15 that morning were heard around the world, though their true significance would not become clear for weeks. Princip's bullets found their mark, killing both the Archduke and his beloved wife Sophie within minutes. Yet even in this moment of historical clarity, questions linger. Was Princip merely a lucky terrorist who happened to be in the right place at the right time, or was there something more orchestrated about his presence on that particular street corner? The investigation that followed revealed a web of nationalist conspiracies stretching from Belgrade to Vienna, involving secret societies with names like the Black Hand and Unity or Death. These organizations had been plotting against Austro-Hungarian rule for years, funded by shadowy sources and connected to intelligence networks that operated in the grey spaces between official diplomacy and outright espionage. The deeper investigators dug, the more complex the picture became, until it was nearly impossible to separate genuine nationalist fervor from the machinations of great power politics. In the month that followed the assassination, Europe's leaders engaged in a deadly game of diplomatic chess, each move calculated to preserve their nation's honor while avoiding the catastrophic war that everyone claimed they wanted to prevent. Kaiser Wilhelm assured his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, that peace could be maintained through careful negotiation. British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey worked frantically behind the scenes to broker a settlement. French President Raymond Poincaré spoke publicly of restraint while privately assuring Russia of French support. Yet beneath these diplomatic niceties, a more sinister reality was taking shape. The alliance system that was supposed to maintain the balance of power in Europe had become a trap. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia that was designed to be rejected. When Serbia, backed by Russia, refused to comply completely, the dominoes began to fall with mechanical precision. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France, bound by treaty to Russia, found itself at war with Germany. Britain, committed to Belgian neutrality, entered the conflict when German troops crossed the Belgian border. The speed with which Europe descended into total war astonished even those who had helped orchestrate it. General Helmuth von Moltke, the German chief of staff, had spent years perfecting the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy designed to knock France out of the war quickly before turning to face Russia. The plan depended on precise timing and the element of surprise, yet its very existence created the pressure for immediate action that made peaceful resolution impossible. What makes this chain of events so mysterious is not what happened, but what might have been prevented. At several crucial moments during the July crisis, individual decisions by key leaders could have changed the course of history. What if Archduke Franz Ferdinand had cancelled his visit to Sarajevo after the first assassination attempt? What if Kaiser Wilhelm had restrained Austria-Hungary instead of giving them the infamous blank check of support? What if Tsar Nicholas had chosen partial rather than full mobilization? What if the British had made their intentions clear earlier rather than maintaining ambiguity about whether they would enter a continental war? The tragedy is that none of these leaders wanted the war that actually occurred. They had all grown up in an era when conflicts between European powers were limited affairs, settled through diplomacy or brief decisive campaigns. The idea of a 4-year struggle that would consume entire empires and kill millions of soldiers seemed unthinkable. Kaiser Wilhelm spoke of his troops being home before the leaves fell. French soldiers marched to the front wearing bright red trousers as if they were heading to a parade rather than the most deadly conflict in human history up to that point. The first battles of the war revealed how completely the political leaders had miscalculated. The German advance through Belgium met fierce resistance that slowed their carefully timed schedule. The French offensive in Alsace-Lorraine ended in devastating casualties. The Russian invasion of East Prussia began successfully, but collapsed into chaos and defeat. Within weeks, it became clear that this would not be the short, decisive conflict that everyone had planned for, but something entirely different, something the world had never seen before. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to fall, German troops were still fighting in France, but they were now digging trenches rather than marching toward Paris. The war of movement that all the generals had prepared for was transforming into a war of attrition that none of them understood. The weapons that were supposed to bring quick victory, the machine guns and heavy artillery, proved to be instruments of stalemate, creating killing fields where attacks measured in yards cost thousands of lives. In the capitals of Europe, the same leaders who had sleepwalked into war now found themselves presiding over a conflict that seemed to have taken on a life of its own. The alliances that were meant to provide security had become chains that dragged entire continents into the abyss. The military plans that were designed to ensure quick victory had created a situation where victory itself became almost meaningless, measured only in the ability to outlast the enemy's capacity for suffering. The mystery of how the Great War began is not really a mystery of facts, but a mystery of human nature. How did rational, educated leaders convince themselves that catastrophic risk was worth taking for marginal gains? How did nations that prided themselves on civilization unleash forces of destruction that would scar the landscape of Europe for generations? How did a single pistol shot in an obscure Balkan city trigger the collapse of empires that had stood for centuries? Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this mystery is that the war everyone got was not the war anyone wanted. The quick, decisive conflict that would strengthen their position and humble their enemies never materialized. Instead, they created a grinding, relentless struggle that would consume not just armies, but entire societies, transforming the political and social order of Europe in ways that no one in 1914 could have imagined. As the first year of the war drew to a close, it was already clear that something fundamental had changed in the nature of human conflict. This was no longer a war between professional armies fighting for limited objectives, but a total war that would demand everything from everyone. The mysterious forces that had been unleashed in the summer of 1914 would continue to shape the world for decades to come, creating new nations, destroying old empires, and planting the seeds of conflicts that would not be resolved for generations. And so we find ourselves confronting the central mystery of the Great War's beginning, not in the specific events that triggered it, but in the deeper question of whether such a catastrophe was truly inevitable, or whether it represents one of history's great tragic accidents, a war that nobody expected, nobody wanted, and nobody knew how to stop once it had begun. On the windswept shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula, where the waters of the Dardanelles meet the Aegean Sea, stands a simple monument that speaks to one of the Great War's most enduring mysteries. The inscription bears the names of hundreds of British soldiers who disappeared without trace on a warm August morning in 1915, vanishing so completely that their fate remains unknown more than a century later. This is the story of the 1st 5th Norfolk Regiment, known to history as the Sandringham Company because so many of its members had worked on the royal estate of King George V. The Gallipoli campaign had begun in April 1915 with such promise. British and French warships had attempted to force their way through the Dardanelles Strait, hoping to reach Constantinople and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. When the naval assault failed, military planners conceived an ambitious land invasion that would capture the peninsula and open the sea route to Russia. It was a strategy born of frustration with the stalemate on the Western Front, a bold attempt to find victory through a back door that everyone hoped would be lightly defended. The reality proved far different from the plans drawn up in comfortable London offices. The Turkish defenders, led by a young colonel named Mustafa Kemal, who would later become known as Ataturk, had used the months since the failed naval attack to prepare formidable defences. When British, Australian, New Zealand and French troops landed on the beaches, they found themselves facing not the quick advance to victory they had expected, but another grinding war of trenches, barbed wire and machine gun nests. By August, the Gallipoli expedition had settled into the same deadly routine that characterized fighting on the Western Front. Small gains were measured in yards and paid for in hundreds of lives. The summer heat was oppressive, water was scarce, and disease ran rampant through the crowded trenches. It was in this context of growing desperation that British commanders planned one final push that they hoped would break the Turkish lines and salvage something from the increasingly costly campaign. The 1st 5th Norfolk Regiment had arrived at Gallipoli in early August, part of a fresh division that was supposed to inject new energy into the stalled offensive. These were not professional soldiers but territorial volunteers, men who had joined up in response to Lord Kitchener's call for volunteers. Many had indeed worked on the Sandringham estate, gamekeepers and gardeners and stable hands who knew each other from years of shared labour in the Norfolk countryside. They had trained together, sailed to the Mediterranean together, and now found themselves preparing for their first major battle together. On the morning of August 12, 1915, the Norfolks were ordered to advance as part of a larger attack against Turkish positions near a place called Hill 60. The plan, like so many others in this war, looked simple on paper. Artillery would bombard the Turkish trenches, then the infantry would advance and capture the enemy positions. The Norfolk Regiment was given a specific objective, a stretch of Turkish line that needed to be taken and held. What happened next depends entirely on who was telling the story. According to the official British account, the Norfolk Regiment advanced into difficult terrain and became separated from the main force. They encountered heavy Turkish resistance and were either killed or captured, though no bodies were found and no prisoners were reported. The regiment had simply vanished, swallowed up by the chaos and confusion of battle. But there were other accounts, stranger versions of events that would grow into legend over the years that followed. Several members of a New Zealand unit claimed to have witnessed something extraordinary that morning. They reported seeing the Norfolk Regiment advance toward a group of low hills that were shrouded in an unusual cloud or mist. According to these witnesses, the entire battalion, several hundred men, marched directly into this cloud formation and disappeared. When the mist cleared, both the soldiers and the cloud were gone, leaving behind empty hillsides where neither the Norfolks nor their Turkish opponents could be found. The story was so strange that it was initially dismissed by military authorities as the product of battlefield stress and confusion. War, after all, creates its own fog of uncertainty, where exhausted men under extreme pressure can experience hallucinations or misremember events in remarkable ways. The human mind, when confronted with the incomprehensible violence and chaos of modern combat, sometimes creates explanations that make more sense than the brutal reality of industrial warfare. Yet the story persisted, passed down through the ranks and carried home by survivors of the Gallipoli campaign. In the years after the war, several of the New Zealand witnesses repeated their accounts in interviews with journalists and historians. They insisted that what they had seen was not a normal battle engagement, but something genuinely mysterious, a disappearance that defied conventional explanation. Frederick Reichart, a member of the Canterbury Battalion, described watching the Norfolks advance in perfect formation toward what he called a solid-looking cloud that rested on the hillside like a dense fog bank. The cloud appeared to be motionless despite a steady breeze that was moving other clouds across the sky. When the soldiers entered the cloud, Reichart claimed, they seemed to be absorbed into it rather than simply obscured by it. After about an hour, the cloud lifted straight up into the sky and vanished, revealing empty ground where both the British soldiers and the Turkish defenders should have been. Another witness, Sapper Bert Baxter of the New Zealand Engineers, provided a similar account but with additional details that made the story even more puzzling. Baxter claimed that the cloud had an unusual appearance, more solid and uniform than any natural fog he had ever seen. He also reported that the Turkish firing, which had been continuous throughout the morning, stopped abruptly when the cloud appeared, as if the enemy defenders had also been affected by whatever was happening on the hillside. These eyewitness accounts created a mystery that would fascinate researchers for decades. If the stories were true, what had happened to more than 200 British soldiers? Had they been captured en masse by Turkish forces? Had they become lost in unfamiliar terrain and wandered into areas controlled by the enemy? Or had something genuinely inexplicable occurred on that August morning in 1915? The official investigation that followed the disappearance was hampered by the chaos of the continuing battle and the general breakdown in communication that characterized the Gallipoli campaign. Records were incomplete, witnesses were scattered across different units, and the immediate priority was continuing the fight rather than solving mysteries about missing soldiers. The initial report concluded that the Norfolk Regiment had been overwhelmed by Turkish forces in an area where the difficult terrain made recovery of bodies impossible. This explanation satisfied military bureaucracy but left many questions unanswered. If the Norfolks had been killed or captured in a conventional battle, why were there no Turkish reports of such a significant engagement? The Ottoman forces were generally quite good at documenting their victories, particularly when they involved the destruction of entire enemy units. Yet searches through Turkish military archives revealed no mention of a major clash with British forces in the specific area where the Norfolks had supposedly met their fate. The mystery deepened when researchers began to examine the terrain where the disappearance had occurred. The hillsides near Suvla Bay were indeed difficult ground, cut by ravines and covered with thick scrub that could easily conceal small groups of men. However, the idea that several hundred soldiers could vanish without trace in an area that was under observation by multiple units from different armies seemed increasingly implausible. In 1919, 4 years after the disappearance, the newly formed Imperial War Graves Commission began the grim task of locating and identifying the remains of soldiers killed at Gallipoli. Teams of investigators combed the peninsula, following up on reports from veterans and searching areas where battles had been fought. They found thousands of bodies, British and Turkish alike, in the ravines and hillsides where the fighting had been heaviest. But despite extensive searches in the area where the Norfolk Regiment had last been seen, no trace of the missing soldiers was discovered. The absence of physical evidence only fueled more speculation about what had really happened. Some researchers suggested that the Norfolks had been buried in a mass grave by Turkish forces who wanted to conceal the extent of British casualties from their own propaganda purposes. Others proposed that the soldiers had been taken prisoner and marched to camps in the interior of the Ottoman Empire, where they had died of disease or mistreatment far from the battlefield. More exotic theories began to emerge as the decades passed and the mystery remained unsolved. Some writers suggested that the strange cloud described by witnesses had been a natural phenomenon, perhaps a rare type of ground fog that had created optical illusions and confused both the advancing soldiers and the observers watching from a distance. Others proposed that the disappearance had been caused by a previously unknown type of weapon, perhaps a gas attack that had been so effective it had eliminated all trace of its victims. The most persistent alternative explanation focused on the possibility that the eyewitness accounts, however sincere, were simply wrong. War creates enormous stress on human perception and memory, and soldiers operating under extreme conditions often report seeing things that did not actually happen. The witnesses might have observed a conventional battle engagement, but remembered it in a distorted way that created the impression of something supernatural. Modern military historians who have studied the Gallipoli campaign generally favor explanations that fit within the normal parameters of warfare, even if they cannot be definitively proven. The most likely scenario, according to this view, is that the Norfolk Regiment advanced into an area where they were cut off and surrounded by Turkish forces. Unable to retreat and facing overwhelming odds, they fought to the last man in small groups scattered across difficult terrain. Their bodies were either buried by the Turks or lost in ravines and caves that were never properly searched. This conventional explanation accounts for most of the known facts while avoiding the need to invoke mysterious clouds or supernatural disappearances. It fits the pattern of other unit losses during the Gallipoli campaign, where small groups of soldiers often became isolated and were killed or captured without leaving clear traces for investigators to follow. Yet the mystery refuses to die completely. In 1965, 50 years after the disappearance, a team of British researchers returned to Gallipoli with permission from the Turkish government to conduct a new search for the missing soldiers. Using more sophisticated techniques than had been available in 1919, they hoped to finally locate the remains of the Norfolk Regiment and put the mystery to rest. The search revealed several previously undiscovered burial sites containing the remains of British soldiers, but none that could be definitively linked to the missing Norfolks. The investigators did find evidence of intense fighting in areas that had not been thoroughly examined before, suggesting that the original searches had been incomplete. However, they also discovered that decades of erosion, construction, and agricultural activity had significantly altered the landscape, making it unlikely that a complete accounting would ever be possible. The enduring fascination with the vanishing Norfolk Regiment reflects something deeper than simple curiosity about a military mystery. The story touches on fundamental questions about the nature of war and the limits of human understanding when confronted with extreme circumstances. In a conflict that had already shattered so many assumptions about civilized behavior and rational planning, the idea that an entire battalion could simply vanish seemed to symbolize the larger incomprehensibility of the Great War itself. Perhaps that is the real mystery of the Norfolk Regiment, not what happened to those specific soldiers on that specific morning, but what their disappearance represents about the nature of modern warfare. In a conflict where millions of men died in ways that would have been unimaginable to previous generations, the vanishing of a few hundred soldiers becomes a metaphor for all the losses that could never be properly explained or adequately mourned. The cloud that supposedly swallowed the Sandringham Company becomes a symbol for the fog of war itself, the confusion and chaos that made so much of the Great War ultimately unknowable. Beneath the grey waters of the North Sea, where the currents run cold and deep even in summer, lies a story that speaks to the particular terrors of underwater warfare in the early days of the Great War. The submarine was still a relatively new weapon in 1914, a strange and dangerous craft that pushed the boundaries of human ingenuity and courage. For the men who sailed these steel tubes into the darkness below the waves, every mission carried the possibility of simply vanishing without trace, swallowed by an element that had claimed countless ships throughout history, but now offered new and more mysterious ways to disappear. HMS submarine E3 was one of the Royal Navy's newest boats when war broke out, part of the E-class that represented the cutting edge of British submarine technology. At 180 feet long and displacing nearly 800 tons when submerged, she was a formidable weapon designed to patrol the hostile waters around the German coast and sink enemy vessels wherever they might be found. Her crew of 30 men under the command of Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Cholmondeley had trained extensively in the relatively safe waters around the British Isles, but nothing could truly prepare them for the reality of operating in enemy territory where a single mistake might mean death for everyone aboard. The early months of the war had revealed both the promise and the peril of submarine warfare. German U-boats had already demonstrated their deadly effectiveness by sinking several British warships, proving that these underwater predators could strike with devastating impact before disappearing back into the depths. The Royal Navy was eager to return the favor, sending its own submarines into the dangerous waters of the Heligoland Bight and the approaches to German naval bases, where they hoped to catch enemy ships venturing out to sea. On October 17, 1914, E3 departed from her base at Harwich on what should have been a routine patrol mission. Her orders were to proceed to the area around the German island of Heligoland, where intelligence reports suggested that enemy warships might be operating. The mission was considered dangerous but not exceptionally so, the kind of patrol that British submarines had been conducting with reasonable success since the beginning of the war. Lieutenant Commander Cholmondeley was an experienced officer who had been with the submarine service since its early days. His crew trusted him implicitly, and he had earned a reputation for careful seamanship and sound judgment under pressure. The boat itself had been thoroughly inspected before departure and was reported to be in excellent mechanical condition. Everything suggested that this would be another successful patrol that would add to the growing reputation of British submarine operations in the North Sea. The first day of the patrol proceeded according to plan. E3 sent a routine radio message confirming her position and reporting that all was well aboard. This was the last communication that anyone would ever receive from the submarine. When she failed to report at the scheduled time the following day, her commanders at Harwich initially assumed that radio problems were preventing contact. Submarines operating in enemy waters often maintained radio silence to avoid detection, and mechanical failures with the primitive wireless equipment of the time were not uncommon. As hours turned to days without any word from E3, concern began to mount at British Naval Headquarters. Other submarines operating in the same general area reported no contact with the missing boat, and there had been no reports of submarine attacks or sightings from either British or neutral vessels in the region. It was as if E3 had simply vanished from the face of the Earth, leaving no trace of her passage or any clue about what might have befallen her and her crew. The initial search efforts were hampered by the same factors that made submarine operations so dangerous in the first place. The North Sea in October was a hostile environment even for surface ships, with frequent storms and limited visibility that made systematic searching nearly impossible. The vast area of ocean that E3 might have reached during her patrol covered hundreds of square miles, and the submarine could have gone down anywhere within that range without leaving any visible evidence on the surface. German naval records from the period provided few clues about what might have happened to the missing submarine. While German forces had indeed been active in the area where E3 was operating, there were no reports of successful attacks on British submarines during the relevant time period. German commanders were generally quite thorough in documenting their victories, particularly early in the war when submarine successes were still relatively rare and highly valued for propaganda purposes. The absence of German claims of responsibility only deepened the mystery surrounding E3's disappearance. If the submarine had been sunk by enemy action, it seemed likely that the Germans would have reported such a success. The fact that they made no such claims suggested either that they were unaware of having sunk a British submarine, or that E3 had met her fate through some other means entirely. One possibility that naval investigators considered was that E3 had suffered some kind of mechanical failure that had caused her to sink in deep water where her wreck would be impossible to locate. Early submarines were notoriously prone to equipment failures, and the technology for underwater operations was still being perfected through painful trial and error. A leak in the pressure hull, a failure of the diving systems, or an explosion in the battery compartment could all have caused a submarine to sink so quickly that there would be no time to send a distress signal or deploy emergency equipment. The batteries that powered submerged operations were particularly dangerous in the early submarines. These massive lead-acid cells produced hydrogen gas as a byproduct of their operation, and if this gas was allowed to accumulate in insufficient ventilation, it could create an explosive mixture that would detonate from the smallest spark. Several submarines had been lost to battery explosions, and the enclosed environment of a submerged vessel meant that such accidents were almost always fatal to the entire crew. Another theory focused on the possibility that E3 had become entangled in one of the many underwater obstacles that littered the North Sea. The Germans had begun deploying defensive minefields around their naval bases, and while these were primarily designed to sink surface ships, they posed a significant hazard to submarines as well. A submarine operating at periscope depth might easily become entangled in the cables that anchored mines to the seafloor, and attempts to free the vessel could cause the mines to detonate with catastrophic results. The coastal waters around Germany were also filled with fishing nets, telegraph cables, and other underwater obstructions that could trap an unwary submarine. Commercial fishing had been suspended in many areas due to the war, but abandoned nets and gear remained on the seafloor where they could snare a passing submarine. Telegraph cables were particularly dangerous because they were made of strong steel wire that could wrap around a submarine's propellers or diving planes and prevent the vessel from surfacing. As weeks passed without any trace of E3, the Royal Navy was forced to accept that the submarine and her crew were almost certainly lost. The official designation was changed from missing to presumed sunk, and the families of the 30 men aboard were notified that their loved ones would not be coming home. For the submarine service, it was a sobering reminder of the risks that every crew faced each time they submerged beneath the hostile waters of the North Sea. The loss of E3 was particularly frustrating because it provided no lessons that might help prevent similar disasters in the future. Without knowing what had caused the submarine to disappear, naval commanders could not issue new safety procedures or modify equipment to address the problem. The mystery of her fate served as a constant reminder that submarine warfare remained an unpredictable and dangerous business, where experienced crews and well-maintained vessels could still vanish without explanation. In the decades that followed the war, several attempts were made to locate the wreck of E3 and determine what had caused her loss. Advances in underwater technology made it possible to search areas of the North Sea that had been inaccessible to investigators in 1914, and there was hope that the submarine's final resting place might eventually be found. These efforts were motivated not just by historical curiosity, but by a desire to provide closure for the families of the men who had died and to honor their sacrifice with a proper memorial. The breakthrough came in 1976, more than 60 years after E3 had disappeared. A commercial fishing vessel operating in the North Sea snagged its nets on an underwater obstruction and brought up pieces of metal that were identified as coming from a World War I-era submarine. The location was approximately 50 miles northeast of the original patrol area, suggesting that E3 had traveled further than initially assumed before meeting her fate. A detailed underwater survey of the wreck site revealed the remains of HMS submarine E3 lying in 90 feet of water, her hull partially buried in the sandy bottom of the North Sea. The condition of the wreck provided important clues about what had happened during those final moments in October 1914. The submarine's bow section showed evidence of a massive explosion that had torn through the forward compartments, while the stern remained relatively intact. The discovery of the wreck answered some questions about E3's fate, but raised others that proved even more puzzling. The explosion damage was consistent with the submarine having struck a mine, which would explain both the sudden loss of contact and the absence of German claims of responsibility. However, the location of the wreck was outside the known German minefield areas, and no mines had been reported in that part of the North Sea during the relevant time period. Further investigation revealed that the explosion had occurred in the torpedo compartment, where E3 carried her primary weapons. This suggested the possibility that the submarine had suffered an internal explosion rather than striking an external mine. Torpedo warheads were notoriously unstable in the early years of the war, and several submarines had been lost when their own weapons detonated accidentally. The confined space of a submerged vessel meant that even a single torpedo explosion could cause catastrophic damage that would sink the boat within minutes. Yet this explanation also had problems that did not fit with other evidence from the wreck site. The pattern of damage suggested that the explosion had come from outside the submarine rather than from within the torpedo compartment. The hull plating was bent inward rather than outward, indicating that the force had been applied from the surrounding water rather than from inside the vessel. This was more consistent with a mine explosion than with an accidental detonation of the submarine's own weapons. The mystery was further complicated by the discovery of what appeared to be unexploded ordnance near the wreck site. Divers found several cylindrical objects that resembled mines or depth charges, though they were too corroded to determine their exact origin or vintage. The presence of these weapons suggested that the area had indeed been mined, despite the absence of any contemporary records indicating such activity. One possibility that investigators considered was that E3 had encountered a previously unknown German mining operation. The German Navy had been experimenting with various types of underwater weapons in the early months of the war, and it was possible that they had deployed experimental mines in areas that were not documented in their official records. Such weapons might have been intended as tests of new technology rather than permanent defensive installations, which would explain why they did not appear in standard German naval archives. Another theory focused on the possibility that E3 had been the victim of friendly fire, accidentally destroyed by British forces that mistook her for an enemy submarine. The early months of the war had seen several tragic incidents where Allied vessels had attacked each other due to misidentification or communication failures. British mines or depth charges deployed by surface vessels might have caused the explosion that sank E3, though this would have required a series of remarkable coincidences and communication breakdowns. The human cost of E3's loss extended far beyond the 30 men who died when the submarine sank. Each crew member left behind families who had waited years for news that would never come, and communities across Britain that had contributed sons and fathers to the submarine service. The mystery of what had happened to their loved ones added an extra layer of grief to the already heavy burden of wartime loss. Lieutenant Commander Cholmondeley's wife had continued to hope for years that her husband and his crew might have been taken prisoner and would eventually return home. The submarine service was so new that there were few precedents for how to handle missing boats, and families often clung to the possibility that their men might have survived even the most catastrophic circumstances. The discovery of the wreck in 1976 finally provided the certainty that had been missing for more than 60 years, but it also confirmed the worst fears of those who had never stopped hoping for a different outcome. The story of HMS Submarine E3 serves as a reminder of how the Great War pushed technology and human courage to their limits, often with tragic consequences. The men who volunteered for submarine service knew that they were pioneering a new form of warfare that carried extraordinary risks. They accepted these dangers because they believed in their cause and trusted in their training, but they could not have anticipated how many ways there were to disappear beneath the waters of the North Sea. In the end, the mystery of E3 is not really about what caused her to sink, but about the broader question of how human beings cope with the unknown dangers of war. The submarine's crew faced their fate with the same courage that characterized their service, disappearing into the depths while carrying out their duty to protect the ships and shores of their homeland. Their sacrifice reminds us that some mysteries are more important for what they represent than for how they might eventually be solved. In the months before the Great War transformed the world, when Europe still basked in the illusion of permanent peace and progress, a peculiar terror began to grip the British Isles. It started with isolated reports from farmers and fishermen, stories that might have been dismissed as the products of overactive imaginations if they had not begun to multiply with alarming frequency. Across the length and breadth of Britain, from the Scottish Highlands to the English Channel, ordinary people were reporting sightings of mysterious aircraft moving silently through the night sky, their presence marked only by searchlights that swept the countryside below and the distant hum of engines that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. These were not the familiar shapes of British military aircraft, which were still primitive affairs of wood and canvas that could barely stay aloft in calm weather. The objects described by witnesses were enormous, cigar-shaped vessels that moved with purpose and authority across the darkness, following routes that suggested detailed knowledge of British geography and strategic installations. To the people who saw them, there could be only one explanation for such advanced flying machines. They had to be German Zeppelins, conducting reconnaissance missions in preparation for the invasion that military experts had been warning about for years. The airship scare of 1913 and 1914 represents one of the most fascinating examples of mass hysteria in modern British history, yet it also raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Were these sightings purely the product of collective imagination, fueled by growing tensions with Germany and fears of technological superiority, or did something more substantial lie behind the reports, perhaps genuine German reconnaissance missions that were never officially acknowledged, or natural phenomena that were misinterpreted by observers who had no frame of reference for understanding what they were seeing? The reports began in earnest during the winter of 1913, when several witnesses in different parts of England described seeing large, elongated objects moving across the night sky. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Enormous airships with powerful searchlights that seemed to be examining the countryside below with systematic thoroughness. The vessels were always seen at night, always moved slowly and deliberately, and always disappeared before any official investigation could be mounted. One of the earliest and most detailed sightings occurred near the town of Dover, where a Coast Guard station reported observing a large airship moving parallel to the English Channel for nearly an hour. The duty officer, a man with years of experience watching the waters for signs of smuggling or other suspicious activity, described the object as being at least 300 feet long and equipped with multiple lights that illuminated the ground below as it passed. The airship appeared to be following the coastline with the kind of precision that suggested familiarity with local landmarks and navigation points. What made this particular sighting especially unsettling was the apparent interest that the mysterious vessel showed in British coastal defenses. The Coast Guard officer reported that the airship's searchlight had lingered over gun emplacements and harbor installations, sweeping back and forth as if photographing or mapping these strategic locations. When dawn approached, the object had turned eastward and disappeared over the channel, heading in the direction of continental Europe. Similar reports began to accumulate from across the country, creating a pattern that seemed too widespread and consistent to be explained as isolated cases of mistaken identity. In Yorkshire, farmers reported seeing airships conducting what appeared to be systematic surveys of railway lines and industrial facilities. In Scotland, lighthouse keepers described enormous flying machines that passed overhead with such regularity that they began to keep detailed logs of the sightings. In Wales, miners coming off the night shift told stories of mysterious lights that followed the valleys where coal was extracted and transported to the ports. The British press initially treated these reports with skepticism, dismissing them as examples of the kind of invasion paranoia that had been building in Britain since the turn of the century. Popular novels and newspaper articles had been warning of German plans to attack Britain for years, and it seemed natural that such fears would eventually manifest themselves in the form of imaginary enemy aircraft. The Daily Mail, which had been particularly vocal in promoting concerns about German military preparations, found itself in the awkward position of having to decide whether to embrace these stories as confirmation of their warnings or to debunk them as products of the hysteria they had helped to create. Government officials were equally uncertain about how to respond to the growing number of reports. The Royal Flying Corps, Britain's military aviation arm, was still a tiny organisation with fewer than 100 aircraft, most of which were barely capable of sustained flight. The idea that German airships were routinely penetrating British airspace should have been a matter of urgent national security, yet there was no evidence beyond eyewitness testimony to confirm that such intrusions were actually taking place. The Admiralty, which was responsible for coastal defence, conducted discreet investigations into some of the more credible reports but found no physical evidence to support the claims of airship activity. No wreckage was discovered, no photographs were obtained, and no radio intercepts suggested the presence of German aircraft in British airspace. The absence of concrete proof led many officials to conclude that the sightings were indeed the product of mass hysteria, though they were careful not to dismiss them publicly for fear of appearing complacent about national security. The mystery deepened when German authorities were unofficially asked about the possibility that their airships might be responsible for the sightings. The German response was a mixture of amusement and concern, suggesting that while they were not conducting secret flights over Britain, they were troubled by the implications of such widespread reports. German military aviation was indeed more advanced than British capabilities at the time, with several large Zeppelin airships in service and more under construction. However, the range and endurance of these early airships made regular reconnaissance flights to Britain technically challenging, if not impossible. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin himself, the pioneer of German airship development, stated publicly that his aircraft were not capable of the kind of long-range missions that would be required for regular flights over British territory. The Zeppelins of 1913 had operational ranges of only a few hundred miles, and their dependence on favorable weather conditions made them unsuitable for the kind of systematic reconnaissance that the British reports seemed to describe. Moreover, the risk of losing an expensive airship over enemy territory would have been enormous, making such missions strategically questionable even if they were technically feasible. Yet the sightings continued with increasing frequency as 1914 progressed, reaching a peak during the spring and early summer before the outbreak of war in August. The reports became so numerous that several newspapers began maintaining regular features devoted to tracking the mysterious airships, complete with maps showing reported flight paths and detailed descriptions provided by witnesses. The phenomenon had become a part of British popular culture, generating everything from music hall songs to political cartoons that depicted German spies floating overhead in gas-filled observation platforms. The geographical pattern of the sightings added another layer of mystery to the phenomenon. The airships seemed to be particularly interested in certain types of locations: naval bases, major railway junctions, industrial centers, and coastal fortifications appeared far more frequently in witness reports than did rural areas or small towns. This suggested either that the objects were indeed conducting systematic intelligence gathering, or that people living near strategically important facilities were more likely to interpret unusual sights as evidence of enemy surveillance. The timing of many sightings was also puzzling. The airships were almost always seen during the hours of darkness, when visual identification was most difficult and when atmospheric conditions could create optical illusions. Yet the descriptions provided by witnesses were often remarkably detailed, suggesting either that the objects were equipped with very bright illumination or that observers were seeing something other than conventional aircraft. Several attempts were made to photograph the mysterious airships, but these efforts were uniformly unsuccessful. The primitive cameras of the time required long exposure times and bright lighting conditions, making night photography extremely difficult. The few images that were claimed to show airships turned out to be either obvious fakes or pictures of conventional objects that had been misidentified. The absence of photographic evidence further fueled skepticism about the reality of the sightings, though supporters argued that the lack of pictures simply proved how elusive and well-organized the German reconnaissance operations were. The outbreak of war in August 1914 brought an abrupt end to the phantom airship reports, though not in the way that might have been expected. If German Zeppelins had indeed been conducting reconnaissance flights over Britain, the declaration of hostilities should have led to increased activity as military intelligence became more urgent. Instead, the sightings virtually disappeared overnight, suggesting that whatever had been causing them was no longer a factor once actual warfare began. This pattern led some investigators to propose that the phantom airships had been the product of pre-war German intelligence operations that were discontinued once open conflict made such covert activities unnecessary. According to this theory, the German military had indeed been using advanced airships to gather information about British defences, but had withdrawn these operations when they were no longer needed. The sudden cessation of sightings after the declaration of war seemed to support this interpretation. However, other analysts argued that the timing of the phenomenon's end actually supported the mass hysteria explanation. Once real German Zeppelins began appearing over British cities in 1915, conducting actual bombing raids that killed real people and caused visible damage, the public's attention shifted from mysterious phantom aircraft to the very concrete threat of aerial warfare. The psychological need to see enemy aircraft where none existed disappeared when genuine enemy aircraft became an unfortunate reality. The few German Zeppelin raids that did occur during the early months of the war provided an interesting comparison with the phantom airship reports. The real Zeppelins were indeed enormous and impressive machines, but they were also noisy, slow, and vulnerable to weather conditions. They conducted their missions with great difficulty and considerable risk, often becoming lost or suffering mechanical failures that forced emergency landings in neutral territory. The contrast between these struggling reality and the efficient systematic reconnaissance described in the pre-war sightings was striking. Modern analysis of the phantom airship phenomenon has suggested several possible explanations that do not require either German secret operations or mass hallucinations. Atmospheric conditions in the months before the war were particularly favorable for the creation of unusual optical effects, including temperature inversions that could cause distant lights to appear much larger and closer than they actually were. The lights of ships at sea, distant aircraft, or even astronomical phenomena could have been magnified and distorted by atmospheric conditions to create the appearance of large nearby objects. The psychological climate of pre-war Britain was also conducive to misinterpretation of unusual sights. Years of warnings about German military preparations had created a population that was primed to see evidence of enemy activity in any unexplained phenomenon. The growing tension between Britain and Germany made it almost inevitable that mysterious objects in the sky would be interpreted as evidence of hostile reconnaissance, regardless of their actual origin. The role of the press in amplifying and spreading the airship reports cannot be underestimated. Newspapers of the time were engaged in fierce competition for readership, and stories about mysterious aircraft provided exactly the kind of sensational content that sold papers. Once the first few reports were published, they created a template that influenced how subsequent witnesses interpreted and described their own experiences. The consistent details in many reports might reflect not actual consistency in what was observed, but the influence of media coverage on how people processed and remembered unusual sightings. Yet for all the rational explanations that can be offered for the phantom airship scare, something about the phenomenon continues to resist easy categorization. The sheer number of reports, their geographical spread, and the consistency of certain details suggest that something unusual was indeed happening in British skies during the months before the Great War began. Whether that something was German reconnaissance, natural phenomena, or collective imagination may be less important than what the episode reveals about the psychology of a nation on the brink of an unprecedented conflict. The phantom airships of 1913 and 1914 serve as a reminder that the Great War began not with the first shots fired in August 1914, but with months of growing tension and mounting fear that prepared populations across Europe for the conflict that was to come. In Britain, this preparation took the form of a nationwide obsession with mysterious aircraft that may or may not have existed, but which certainly existed in the collective imagination of a people who were already beginning to live under the shadow of war. The mystery of whether German Zeppelins actually flew reconnaissance missions over Britain before the war may never be definitively resolved. What is certain is that the fear of such missions was real and widespread, shaping British attitudes toward aerial warfare and defense preparations in ways that would prove significant once actual air raids began. In the end, the phantom airships accomplished something that real reconnaissance might not have achieved. They alerted an entire nation to its vulnerability from the sky and prepared the British people for the aerial dimension of modern warfare that was about to be unleashed upon the world. In the quiet halls of the British Admiralty building on a cold January morning in 1917, a small group of men gathered around a single sheet of paper that would change the course of the Great War. The document before them appeared unremarkable at first glance, nothing more than a series of seemingly random numbers arranged in neat rows across the page. Yet hidden within those innocent-looking digits was a message so explosive that its revelation would bring the United States into the conflict and seal Germany's fate. This was the famous Zimmerman telegram, intercepted by British intelligence and decoded through a combination of brilliant cryptanalysis and extraordinary good fortune that some historians still find almost too convenient to believe. The story of how this crucial document came to light begins not in the corridors of power but in the mundane world of international telecommunications. Since the beginning of the war, British naval forces had systematically cut the underwater telegraph cables that connected Germany to the outside world, forcing German diplomatic communications to travel through routes that could be monitored by British intelligence. This gave the cryptographers of Room 40, the Admiralty's secret code-breaking department, access to thousands of encrypted German messages, most of which contained routine diplomatic correspondence of little strategic value. Room 40 had been established early in the war under the direction of Admiral Sir Reginald Hall, a man whose talent for intelligence work was matched only by his flair for dramatic timing. The department had already achieved several notable successes in breaking German codes, but nothing that compared to the significance of what they would discover on January 17, 1917. On that date, a routine intercept of German diplomatic traffic yielded a message that would prove to be one of the most important intelligence coups in modern history. The telegram had been sent by Arthur Zimmerman, the German Foreign Secretary, to the German ambassador in Mexico City. Its contents, once decoded, revealed a secret proposal that would have fundamentally altered the balance of power in North America. Germany was offering Mexico a military alliance that would restore to that country the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona that had been lost to the United States in the 19th century. In return, Mexico would enter the war on Germany's side if the United States abandoned its neutrality and joined the conflict against the Central Powers. The audacity of the German proposal was matched only by its strategic logic. By early 1917, German military leaders had concluded that unrestricted submarine warfare was their only hope of winning the war before American industrial might could tip the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. They knew that attacking American ships would likely bring the United States into the conflict, But they calculated that Germany could achieve victory before American forces could be mobilized and transported to Europe. The Mexican alliance was designed as an insurance policy, a way to tie down American troops on their own continent if the submarine campaign failed to achieve its objectives quickly enough. What makes the Zimmerman telegram so mysterious is not its contents, which are well documented, but the circumstances surrounding its interception and decoding. The official British account describes the process as a straightforward example of signals intelligence where skilled cryptographers applied mathematical techniques to break a diplomatic cipher. Yet several aspects of the story raise questions that have never been satisfactorily answered, leading some researchers to wonder whether the British intelligence services knew more about German diplomatic codes than they ever publicly admitted. The first puzzle concerns the timing of the telegram's interception. British codebreakers had been monitoring German diplomatic traffic for more than 2 years without discovering anything approaching the significance of the Zimmerman message. The sudden breakthrough came at precisely the moment when Britain most desperately needed American entry into the war. British forces were exhausted after years of costly battles. The Russian front was collapsing following the February Revolution, and German submarines were taking a devastating toll on Allied shipping. The telegram arrived like a perfectly timed gift that would solve Britain's most pressing strategic problem. The second mystery involves the technical aspects of how the message was decoded. The German diplomatic cipher was supposed to be one of the most secure systems in use at the time, based on a codebook that was changed regularly and distributed only to the most trusted German officials. Yet Room 40 claimed to have broken the cipher with relative ease, using techniques that they described only in the most general terms. The speed with which they decoded such a complex message suggested either remarkable skill or access to information that they preferred not to discuss publicly. Perhaps most puzzling of all was the route that the telegram had taken from Berlin to Mexico City. Instead of using German-controlled communication channels, which would have been more secure but were no longer available due to the cable-cutting operations, the message had been transmitted through systems that passed directly through British territory. This meant that the telegram had traveled from Germany to the United States via Britain, giving British intelligence multiple opportunities to intercept and examine it. The decision to use such a vulnerable route seemed remarkably careless for such a sensitive communication. The German explanation for this apparent security lapse was that they had no choice but to use whatever channels were available, even if those channels passed through enemy territory. The destruction of German cables had left them dependent on neutral communication systems, and they believed that diplomatic immunity would protect their messages from interception. This reasoning was technically sound but strategically naive, suggesting either that German intelligence services were less sophisticated than they appeared, or that they were unaware of the extent of British code-breaking capabilities. When Admiral Hall and his team finished decoding the telegram, they faced a delicate problem that would require as much diplomatic skill as cryptographic expertise. The information was potentially invaluable for bringing the United States into the war, but revealing it publicly would expose British intelligence operations and alert the Germans to the fact that their diplomatic codes had been compromised. The solution they devised was as clever as it was risky. They would arrange for the telegram to be discovered through channels that would conceal British involvement in its interception. The plan that Room 40 developed involved using American intelligence services as unwitting accomplices in their deception. British agents arranged for a copy of the telegram to be obtained from the German telegraph office in Mexico City, where it had been forwarded after being received from Berlin. This copy could then be presented to the Americans as having been acquired through local espionage rather than signal interception, protecting the secret of British code-breaking while still revealing the contents of the German proposal. The execution of this plan required careful coordination between British intelligence and diplomatic personnel in Mexico. Agents had to gain access to the German telegraph office, locate the specific message among hundreds of routine communications, and copy it without arousing suspicion. The operation was successful, but it added another layer of complexity to an already mysterious story. How had British agents known exactly which message to look for among the thousands of telegrams that passed through the Mexico City office? The precision of their search suggested advanced knowledge that could only have come from signal interception. When the telegram was finally presented to American officials in late February 1917, the reaction was everything that British intelligence had hoped for. President Woodrow Wilson, who had spent years trying to keep the United States out of the European conflict, was forced to confront evidence that Germany was actively plotting against American territory. The revelation of the Mexican alliance proposal, combined with Germany's announcement of unrestricted submarine warfare, created the political conditions necessary for American entry into the war. Yet even as the telegram achieved its strategic purpose, questions remained about the authenticity of the document and the circumstances of its discovery. Some American officials wondered whether the British had fabricated the message as a way of manipulating the United States into joining the war. The timing was so convenient and the content so perfectly calculated to inflame American opinion that suspicions of deception seemed natural. These doubts were only partially resolved when Arthur Zimmerman himself confirmed the authenticity of the telegram in a public statement that surprised even his own government. Zimmerman's decision to acknowledge the telegram publicly remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire affair. By confirming that Germany had indeed proposed a military alliance with Mexico, he eliminated any remaining doubts about the document's authenticity, while simultaneously destroying any possibility of denying German responsibility. The admission was so damaging to German interests that it raises questions about Zimmerman's motives and judgment. Was he simply being honest about an operation that had already been exposed, or did he have other reasons for confirming what might have remained a matter of dispute? Some historians have suggested that Zimmerman's confirmation was actually part of a more complex German strategy. By acknowledging the telegram publicly, he might have been trying to demonstrate German resolve and deter American entry into the war through a show of strength. The message to the United States would be clear. Germany was prepared to fight on multiple fronts and had allies ready to join the conflict if necessary. This interpretation suggests that the telegram was as much a diplomatic signal as it was a secret military proposal. The immediate impact of the Zimmerman telegram on American public opinion was dramatic and decisive. Newspapers across the country published the full text of the message, accompanied by editorials denouncing German treachery and calling for immediate military action. The proposal to restore Mexican territories to their former owner struck directly at American national pride and territorial integrity, creating exactly the kind of emotional response that Wilson needed to justify abandoning neutrality. Congress declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, citing the submarine attacks and the Mexican alliance proposal as primary reasons for abandoning neutrality. American entry into the conflict brought fresh troops, modern equipment, and enormous industrial capacity to the Allied cause at precisely the moment when these resources were most desperately needed. The Zimmerman telegram had achieved its intended effect, though not in the way that its author had planned. The long-term consequences of the telegram extended far beyond its immediate impact on American entry into the war. The revelation of German plotting in Mexico poisoned relations between the two countries for years and contributed to ongoing tensions along the United States southern border. Mexico, which had been struggling with internal conflicts and economic problems, found itself caught between the competing pressures of German inducements and American threats. The Mexican government ultimately chose to remain neutral, but the damage to Mexican-American relations took decades to repair. For the British intelligence services, the Zimmerman telegram represented both a triumph and a missed opportunity. They had successfully manipulated American opinion and brought the United States into the war, but they had also revealed capabilities that they would have preferred to keep secret. German diplomatic codes were changed immediately after Zimmerman's public confirmation, cutting off a valuable source of intelligence that had taken years to develop. The short-term gain came at the cost of long-term intelligence assets that might have proved valuable in future conflicts. The technical aspects of how Room 40 broke the German diplomatic cipher remained classified for decades after the war, contributing to ongoing speculation about British cryptographic capabilities. When details were finally released, they revealed sophisticated mathematical techniques and extensive use of stolen or captured codebooks that provided the foundation for understanding German encryption systems. Yet even these revelations left gaps in the story that suggested the full extent of British intelligence operations had not been disclosed. Modern cryptographic analysis of the Zimmerman telegram has confirmed that the document was indeed authentic and that the British account of its interception is generally accurate. However, this analysis has also revealed the existence of multiple versions of the message, encrypted using different codes and transmitted through different channels. The version that became public was not necessarily the only communication between Berlin and Mexico City on this subject, raising the possibility that other aspects of the German-Mexican negotiations remained secret. The discovery of these multiple versions has led some researchers to suggest that the Zimmerman telegram was part of a larger pattern of German diplomatic activity that has never been fully understood. The proposal to Mexico might have been one element in a broader strategy to create anti-American alliances throughout Latin America, involving countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Brazil that had significant German populations and economic ties to the Central Powers. The enduring mystery of the Zimmerman telegram lies not in what it revealed, but in what it continues to conceal about the nature of intelligence operations during the Great War. The document serves as a window into a world of secret communications, code breaking, and diplomatic deception that operated parallel to the public conduct of international relations. The men who intercepted and decoded the telegram were engaged in a shadow war of information and manipulation that was every bit as important as the battles fought in the trenches of the Western Front. In the end, the Zimmerman telegram succeeded in its ultimate purpose, though not in the way that either side had intended. It brought the United States into the war and changed the course of history, but it also demonstrated the power of intelligence operations to shape events in ways that traditional diplomacy and military force could not achieve. The mystery of how this single document came to light at precisely the right moment to alter the fate of nations serves as a reminder that some of the most important battles of the Great War were fought not with guns and artillery, but with codes and secrets that remain hidden even today. On the frozen fields of Belgium and northern France, where the winter of 1914 had turned the landscape into a wasteland of mud, barbed wire, and shattered trees, something extraordinary began to happen as Christmas approached. Along hundreds of miles of trenches that had become the deadly frontier between opposing armies, a miracle was quietly taking shape that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about the nature of war and human nature itself. What started as isolated acts of seasonal goodwill between enemies would grow into the most remarkable and mysterious event of the entire Great War, a spontaneous ceasefire that emerged from the trenches themselves and spread across the Western Front like a gentle contagion of peace. The Christmas truce of 1914 has been celebrated and mythologized for more than a century, yet the deeper mysteries surrounding this extraordinary event have never been fully explained. How did soldiers from opposing armies, who had been trying to kill each other for months, suddenly decide to lay down their weapons and celebrate Christmas together? Why did this unprecedented fraternization occur in some sectors of the front but not others? And perhaps most puzzling of all, why did similar truces never develop again, despite repeated attempts by soldiers on both sides to recreate the magic of that first Christmas of the war? The story begins in the days leading up to Christmas, when the first winter of the war had already destroyed the illusions of quick victory that had sustained both sides through the autumn battles. The German advance toward Paris had been stopped at the Marne, and the subsequent race to the sea had created a continuous line of fortifications stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. What had begun as a war of movement had transformed into something entirely different, a grinding stalemate where men lived like moles in elaborate underground cities, emerging only to participate in futile attacks that gained a few yards at the cost of hundreds of lives. The conditions in the trenches that December were almost beyond human endurance. Rain had turned the battlefield into a swamp where soldiers stood knee-deep in freezing water for days at a time. Artillery bombardments had destroyed most of the buildings in the region, leaving the armies exposed to the elements with inadequate shelter and supplies. Disease was rampant, ammunition was running short, and the original enthusiasm for war had given way to a grim determination to survive until spring brought the possibility of renewed offensive operations. It was against this backdrop of misery and exhaustion that the first signs of Christmas spirit began to appear along the front lines. German soldiers, who had a strong tradition of celebrating Christmas with decorated trees and seasonal songs, began to improvise celebrations using whatever materials they could find in the devastated landscape. British and French soldiers, huddled in their own trenches just a few hundred yards away, could hear the singing drifting across no man's land on the cold night air. The initial contact between the opposing forces was tentative and unofficial, beginning with shouted conversations across the narrow strip of broken ground that separated the rival trench systems. British soldiers reported hearing German voices calling out Christmas greetings in broken English, while German accounts describe British troops responding with their own seasonal wishes. These verbal exchanges gradually grew bolder as soldiers on both sides realized that their enemies were experiencing the same longing for home and peace that they felt themselves. On Christmas Eve, the informal communication took a more visible form when German soldiers began placing small Christmas trees along the edges of their trenches, decorating them with candles and whatever ornaments they could improvise from military supplies. The sight of these tiny lights flickering in the darkness had a profound effect on the men watching from the opposing trenches. Here was a reminder that the enemy consisted not of faceless monsters, but of ordinary human beings who missed their families and longed for the simple pleasures of peacetime life. What happened next varied from sector to sector along the front, creating a patchwork of different experiences that makes it difficult to construct a single, authoritative account of the Christmas truce. In some areas, soldiers emerged from their trenches to meet in no man's land, where they exchanged gifts, shared photographs of their families, and even played impromptu games of football using empty tin cans as balls. In other sectors, the truce remained more cautious, with men simply agreeing not to shoot while they went about the necessary business of burying their dead and repairing their fortifications. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a British officer who described meeting German soldiers in the middle of no man's land on Christmas morning. The Germans had brought coffee and chocolate, while the British contributed cigarettes and tinned food from their rations. The conversation was conducted in a mixture of English, German, and French, with plenty of gesturing to bridge the gaps in communication. What struck the British officer most forcibly was the ordinariness of his enemies. They were not the brutal militarists described in propaganda posters, but young men who seemed as bewildered by the war as he was himself. The football games that supposedly took place during the Christmas truce have become part of popular mythology, though historians debate whether they actually occurred or represent a later embellishment of the story. Several soldiers mentioned kicking balls around in no man's land, but the accounts are often vague about details such as the score or which side won. What seems certain is that some form of recreational activity did occur, whether organized football matches or simply soldiers amusing themselves with improvised games while they enjoyed their unexpected freedom from the constant threat of sniper fire. Perhaps more significant than the games were the conversations that took place between enemies who discovered they had more in common than they had imagined. German soldiers spoke of homes in Bavaria or Prussia that did not sound so different from the English countryside that their opponents remembered. British troops learned that many of the Germans facing them had worked in England before the war, in hotels and restaurants where they had served the very people they were now fighting. The realization that the war had turned friends and neighbors into enemies added a poignant dimension to the temporary peace. The exchange of personal items during the truce created lasting bonds between individual soldiers that would complicate their feelings about the war for months to come. British troops gave away buttons from their uniforms, while Germans shared belt buckles and cap badges as souvenirs. Photographs were particularly prized, as soldiers on both sides were eager to show pictures of their wives, children, and parents to men who understood the pain of separation, even if they could not share the same language. These personal connections made it all the more difficult when the truce began to break down and the reality of war reasserted itself. The process was gradual in most sectors, with soldiers reluctantly returning to their trenches as officers on both sides began to insist that normal military operations must resume. Some units managed to extend the informal ceasefire for several days, but the pressure from higher command eventually forced a return to the deadly routine of sniper fire, artillery bombardments, and surprise raids. What makes the Christmas truce particularly mysterious is the pattern of where it occurred and where it did not. The fraternization was most extensive in sectors held by British and German troops, while areas defended by French forces saw much less spontaneous cooperation. This difference might be explained by the fact that French soldiers were fighting on their own soil and had witnessed the destruction of their homeland, making them less inclined to forgive their enemies. However, even among British and German units, the truce was far from universal, with some sectors maintaining hostile operations throughout the Christmas period. The geographic distribution of the truce suggests that it was not a coordinated plan, but rather a spontaneous outbreak of human sympathy that spread through some parts of the front while leaving others untouched. This raises questions about what specific conditions were necessary for the truce to develop. Was it simply a matter of chance, depending on which individuals happened to be in command of particular sections of the line? Or were there deeper factors, perhaps related to the composition of the units or the particular experiences they had shared, that made fraternization more likely in some places than others? Military censors on both sides initially tried to suppress news of the Christmas truce, recognizing that it posed a serious threat to the war effort. If soldiers could see their enemies as human beings worthy of sympathy and respect, how could they be expected to kill them efficiently when the fighting resumed? The authorities were particularly concerned about the impact on civilian morale, as families at home needed to believe that their sons and husbands were fighting against an implacably evil enemy that deserved no mercy. Despite official attempts at concealment, word of the truce gradually leaked out through letters home and conversations with soldiers on leave. The story captured the imagination of civilian populations who were already growing weary of a war that had cost far more in blood and treasure than anyone had anticipated. Here was proof that the spirit of Christmas could triumph even over the machinery of modern warfare, offering hope that human decency might eventually prevail over the forces of destruction. The reaction of military leaders to reports of the Christmas truce was swift and decisive. Orders were issued to all commanders emphasizing that fraternization with the enemy was strictly forbidden and would be treated as a serious disciplinary offense. Artillery units were instructed to maintain regular bombardments during holiday periods to prevent any recurrence of unauthorized cooperation. Most importantly, troops were rotated more frequently to prevent the development of personal relationships with enemy soldiers in neighboring trenches. These measures proved effective in preventing any repeat of the large-scale fraternization that had characterized Christmas 1914. Although individual acts of kindness between enemies continued throughout the war, particularly in quiet sectors where the fighting was less intense, nothing approaching the scale and spontaneity of the original Christmas truce ever occurred again. The opportunity for such widespread cooperation seemed to have passed, a victim of the increasing brutality and polarization that characterized the later years of the conflict. Several attempts were made to organize informal truces during subsequent Christmas seasons, but these efforts were quickly suppressed by military authorities who had learned to anticipate and prevent such initiatives. The contrast between the success of the 1914 truce and the failure of later attempts highlights one of the most puzzling aspects of the original event. What was it about that particular moment in the war that made spontaneous cooperation possible? Why could the magic of that first Christmas never be recaptured, even when soldiers on both sides desperately wanted to recreate the experience? One theory suggests that the Christmas truce was only possible during the early months of the war, before the conflict had become too bitter and personal for reconciliation. By December 1914, the armies had been fighting for only 4 months, and many soldiers still retained their pre-war assumptions about the fundamental decency of their opponents. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, these attitudes hardened into hatred and desire for revenge that made fraternization emotionally impossible. Another explanation focuses on the specific military situation that existed in December 1914. The front lines had only recently stabilized, and many units were still adjusting to the reality of trench warfare. The improvised nature of the defenses and the relative inexperience of officers may have created conditions where unofficial initiatives could develop before being suppressed by higher authority. As military organizations became more efficient and disciplined, such spontaneous cooperation became much more difficult to achieve. The Christmas truce also occurred at a time when both sides still believed that the war might end relatively quickly, perhaps through negotiated settlement rather than total victory. This hope may have made soldiers more willing to see their enemies as temporary opponents rather than permanent threats. As the conflict became more total and uncompromising, the possibility of reconciliation seemed increasingly remote, making fraternization appear not just forbidden, but pointless. Modern historians have used newly available archival materials to construct a more complete picture of the Christmas truce, revealing that the event was more widespread and complex than was previously understood. Diaries and letters that were hidden from censors during the war provide intimate details of the conversations and activities that took place in no man's land. These sources confirm that the truce was indeed spontaneous rather than organized, emerging simultaneously in dozens of different locations without central coordination. The psychological impact of the Christmas truce extended far beyond its immediate participants, influencing literature, art, and popular culture for generations to come. The image of enemies playing football in no man's land became a powerful symbol of hope and human solidarity that continues to resonate in times of conflict. Yet this same symbolism has sometimes obscured the more complex realities of what actually happened during those few days in December 1914. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Christmas truce is not why it happened, but why it could not be sustained or repeated. The event demonstrated that even in the midst of the most destructive war in human history up to that point, ordinary soldiers retained their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. They could see through the propaganda and hatred that had brought them to the battlefield and recognize the humanity of their supposed enemies. Yet this recognition was not enough to stop the war or even to create lasting areas of peace along the front lines. The failure to build on the Christmas truce suggests something troubling about the nature of modern warfare and political organization. The soldiers who met in no man's land were acting as individuals, following their own moral instincts rather than the orders of their superiors. When institutional authority reasserted itself, their personal connections proved insufficient to resist the larger forces that demanded continued fighting. The truce became a brief interlude rather than a turning point, a reminder of what might have been rather than a foundation for what could still become. In the end, the Christmas truce of 1914 remains one of the most hopeful and heartbreaking episodes of the Great War. It showed that even under the most extreme circumstances, human beings retain their capacity for compassion and understanding. Yet it also demonstrated the limitations of individual goodwill when confronted with the machinery of modern conflict. The soldiers who shared Christmas dinner in no man's land returned to their trenches, knowing that they would soon be trying to kill the men they had just befriended, carrying with them a burden of moral complexity that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the spring of 1918, as the Great War entered its final phase, residents of Paris began to experience a terror unlike anything they had endured during the previous 4 years of conflict. Every 20 minutes, with clockwork precision, enormous shells began falling from the sky onto the French capital, each one carrying enough explosive power to destroy an entire city block. The shells arrived without warning, preceded by no sound of approaching aircraft or nearby artillery fire. They simply materialized out of the clear blue sky like thunderbolts from an angry god, spreading death and destruction across a city that had thought itself safely beyond the reach of German guns. The mystery of what Parisians quickly dubbed the Phantom Bombardment would consume French intelligence services for months and spawn rumors of secret weapons that pushed the boundaries of what 19th century technology could achieve. The shells were clearly coming from German artillery, but no known gun could fire projectiles over such an enormous distance. The closest German positions were more than 70 miles from Paris, far beyond the range of even the largest conventional artillery pieces. Yet here was undeniable evidence that the enemy had somehow found a way to rain death upon the French capital from an impossible distance. The bombardment began on March 21, 1918. Just as the German army was launching its final desperate offensive on the Western Front. The first shell struck the Quai de Seine near the center of the city at 7:20 in the morning, killing 8 people and sending shockwaves through a population that had grown accustomed to the relative safety of being well behind the front lines. Within hours, more shells followed, each one arriving with the same mysterious punctuality that suggested a weapon of extraordinary precision and power. French military engineers immediately began trying to determine the source of the bombardment through careful analysis of the shell fragments and impact patterns. What they discovered defied conventional understanding of artillery technology. The shells were enormous, weighing more than 200 pounds each and containing enough explosive to create craters 30 feet across. The trajectory calculations suggested that they were being fired from a distance of at least 75 miles, requiring a muzzle velocity that seemed impossible to achieve with existing gun designs. Even more puzzling was the accuracy of the mysterious weapon. Despite the enormous distance, many of the shells landed within a few hundred yards of obvious military and political targets. The railway stations that served as supply lines to the front received particular attention, as did government buildings and industrial facilities that supported the war effort. This precision suggested not just a powerful gun, but a sophisticated fire control system that could adjust for wind, weather, and the rotation of the Earth itself. The psychological impact of the bombardment was immediate and devastating. Parisians who had endured years of war suddenly found themselves under direct attack in their own neighborhoods. The shells fell on schools, hospitals, and churches with the same indiscriminate fury that they brought to military targets. On Good Friday, March 29th, a shell struck the Church of Saint-Gervais during evening services, killing 88 worshippers and wounding another 68. The image of innocent civilians being slaughtered while at prayer became a powerful symbol of German brutality that strengthened Allied resolve even as it spread terror through the civilian population. French intelligence services launched an intensive investigation to locate the source of the mysterious bombardment. Reconnaissance aircraft flew deep into German-held territory, searching for the massive gun installation that would be required to fire such enormous projectiles over such a great distance. Spy networks behind enemy lines were activated to search for any evidence of unusual construction or military activity. Artillery experts were consulted to determine what kind of weapon could possibly achieve the observed results. The search initially focused on the area around the Belgian city of Mons, where aerial reconnaissance had detected unusual activity that might indicate the construction of a supergun. However, careful measurement of shell arrival times and impact angles suggested that the weapon was actually located much further south, in the heavily forested region between Laon and Saint-Quentin. This area was under German control and heavily defended, making detailed reconnaissance extremely difficult. As the investigation continued, French engineers began to develop theories about what kind of weapon the Germans might have constructed. The most plausible explanation seemed to be an enormously long barrel gun, perhaps mounted on railway cars to allow it to be moved between different firing positions. Such a weapon would need to be at least 100 feet long to achieve the required muzzle velocity, making it more like a piece of industrial machinery than a conventional artillery piece. The logistics of building and operating such a weapon would have been staggering. The gun would require specially designed shells manufactured to extremely precise tolerances, as even small variations in weight or dimensions would cause wild inaccuracy at such extreme ranges. The amount of propellant needed for each shot would be enormous, requiring tons of specially formulated explosives to achieve the necessary chamber pressure. Most challenging of all, the barrel would experience tremendous stress with each firing, gradually wearing out and losing accuracy as the metal fatigued under repeated shock. Intelligence reports from German prisoners of war and captured documents began to provide clues about what the enemy was calling the Paris-Geschütz, or Paris gun. The weapon was apparently the brainchild of German artillery experts who had been experimenting with long-range bombardment since the early years of the war. The project had been given high priority by the German High Command, which hoped that terror bombing of civilian targets might break French morale and force a negotiated peace before American troops could arrive in significant numbers. What made the Paris gun particularly mysterious was not just its technical specifications, but the secrecy that surrounded its operation. German forces went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the weapon's location and capabilities, moving it frequently between different firing positions and using elaborate camouflage to hide it from aerial reconnaissance. The gun crews were sworn to absolute secrecy and kept isolated from other military units to prevent information leaks. Even within the German army, knowledge of the weapon was restricted to a small circle of high-ranking officers and technical specialists. The mystery deepened when French investigators began to realize that there might be more than one Paris gun in operation. Analysis of shell fragments revealed subtle differences in manufacturing marks that suggested multiple weapons firing different types of ammunition. Some shells contained high explosive charges designed to maximize damage to buildings and personnel, while others carried incendiary materials intended to start fires in the closely packed neighborhoods of central Paris. The existence of multiple guns would explain the sustained rate of fire that the Germans were able to maintain despite the enormous logistical challenges involved in operating such weapons. As spring turned to summer, the Paris gun bombardment became a deadly routine that Parisians learned to live with through a combination of courage and fatalism. Air raid sirens would sound at regular intervals, sending people scrambling for basement shelters and subway stations where they would wait for the all-clear signal. The shells continued to fall with mechanical precision, each one a reminder that the enemy possessed weapons that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of warfare. The French response to the bombardment evolved from purely defensive measures to active attempts to locate and destroy the mysterious weapon. Long-range artillery was positioned to fire counter-battery missions against suspected gun positions, though the extreme range made effective return fire nearly impossible. More promising were plans to use bomber aircraft to attack the Paris gun installations once they could be precisely located. The breakthrough came in July 1918, when a French reconnaissance pilot managed to photograph what appeared to be an enormous gun barrel partially concealed in a railway cutting near the town of Crépy-en-Laonnois. The images showed a weapon unlike anything that had been seen before, a steel tube more than 100 feet long mounted on a massive concrete platform. The gun was surrounded by elaborate camouflage and protected by multiple rings of anti-aircraft defenses, confirming that the Germans considered it a high-value target worthy of extraordinary protection. Armed with precise coordinates, French artillery began a systematic bombardment of the suspected gun position. The counter-battery fire was conducted over several days, with hundreds of shells targeted at the area where the Paris gun was believed to be hidden. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed multiple hits on the gun position, and the bombardment of Paris stopped abruptly on August 9, 1918, suggesting that the weapon had finally been silenced. However, the mystery of the Paris gun was far from solved. When Allied forces overran the suspected gun positions during their final advance in the autumn of 1918, they found elaborate concrete installations and railway infrastructure, but no trace of the actual weapon itself. The Germans had apparently succeeded in evacuating or destroying the gun before it could be captured, taking with them the secrets of its construction and operation. The absence of physical evidence for the Paris gun created a new set of mysteries that would puzzle historians and weapons experts for decades. How had the Germans managed to remove such an enormous weapon without leaving any trace? What had happened to the specialized ammunition, spare parts, and technical documentation that would have been required to operate the gun? Most intriguingly, had the weapon actually been destroyed, or had it been hidden away for potential use in future conflicts? German archives captured after the war provided some answers but raised new questions about the true nature of the Paris gun project. Documents revealed that the weapon had indeed been based on a modified naval gun barrel, stretched to extraordinary length through the addition of multiple barrel sections. The technical challenges had been even greater than French investigators had suspected, with each shot causing significant wear that gradually reduced the gun's accuracy and range. By the time the bombardment ended, the weapon was near the end of its useful life and would have required complete reconstruction to continue firing. The documents also revealed that the Paris gun had been just one element in a broader German program to develop what they called Fernkampfwaffen, or long-distance combat weapons. Other projects had included rocket-powered artillery shells, guided missiles, and even proposals for intercontinental bombardment systems that anticipated technologies that would not become practical until decades later. The Paris gun represented the most successful of these experimental weapons, but it was apparently viewed by its creators as merely a stepping stone toward even more ambitious projects. What makes the Paris gun particularly mysterious is the question of whether similar weapons were ever completed or deployed. German research and development programs during the final years of the war were extensive and highly classified, with many projects being abandoned or destroyed before they could be completed. Allied intelligence services found evidence of numerous experimental weapons programs, but the chaos of the German collapse made it difficult to determine which projects had reached operational status. Some historians have suggested that the Germans succeeded in building multiple Paris guns, but were forced to destroy them to prevent their capture as Allied forces advanced. Others have proposed that the weapon seen by French reconnaissance was actually a decoy designed to draw Allied bombing attacks away from the real gun hidden elsewhere. The most intriguing theory suggests that some components of the Paris gun program were evacuated to secret locations, where they continued to influence weapons development long after the war had ended. The technical legacy of the Paris gun extended far beyond its immediate military impact. The engineering challenges of building such a weapon pushed German metallurgy, ballistics, and precision manufacturing to new levels of sophistication. Many of the innovations developed for the project would later find applications in rocket technology, aircraft design, and industrial engineering. The gun represented an early example of what would later be called weapons of mass destruction, designed to attack civilian populations rather than military targets. The psychological impact of the Paris gun bombardment proved to be more significant than its physical destruction. The 256 shells that fell on Paris killed fewer than 300 people, a relatively small number compared to the casualties being suffered daily on the Western Front. However, the weapon's ability to strike at the heart of France from an impossible distance demonstrated that modern warfare had entered a new phase where no civilian population could consider itself safe from attack. The mystery of what happened to the Paris gun after the war continues to fascinate researchers and conspiracy theorists. Some claim that parts of the weapon were secretly transported to the United States or Soviet Union, where they influenced post-war weapons development programs. Others suggest that the Germans succeeded in hiding complete weapons systems that might still exist in underground bunkers or abandoned military facilities. While these theories lack conclusive evidence, the absence of definitive proof about the gun's ultimate fate keeps such speculation alive. Perhaps the most enduring mystery of the Paris gun is what it represents about the nature of warfare and technological development during the Great War. The weapon emerged from a military culture that was willing to invest enormous resources in experimental technologies that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. It demonstrated both the creative potential and the destructive power of modern industrial societies when they focused their efforts on developing new ways to kill their enemies. The Paris gun also serves as a reminder that some of the most significant weapons of the Great War remain shrouded in secrecy even today. The rapid pace of technological development during the conflict, combined with the chaos and destruction that accompanied its end, created gaps in the historical record that may never be filled. The ghost gun that terrorized Paris in 1918 continues to haunt our understanding of what was possible during those final months of the war, when desperate nations were willing to try almost anything to avoid the fate that was closing in around them. In the quiet hours when we reflect on the mysteries of the Great War, the Paris gun stands as a symbol of humanity's endless capacity for both innovation and destruction. It reminds us that behind every technological breakthrough lies the potential for both creation and annihilation, and that the line between scientific progress and military terror can be frightening thin. The shells that fell on Paris more than a century ago continue to echo through time, asking questions about the nature of warfare and civilization that we have not yet learned how to answer. Beneath the cold waters of the North Sea and the Baltic, scattered across the ocean floors where German warships met their fate during the Great War, lies one of the conflict's most enduring and tantalizing mysteries. In the final months of the war, as the German Empire faced inevitable defeat and the value of its currency collapsed, rumors began to circulate about vast shipments of gold that had been secretly loaded aboard submarines and surface vessels in desperate attempts to preserve the Reich's wealth. These stories spoke of treasure fleets that vanished beneath the waves, carrying with them not just the dreams of a dying empire, but fortunes that would be worth billions in today's currency. The mystery of the Kaiser's lost gold touches on some of the most dramatic moments of the war's end, when German naval commanders faced impossible choices between honor and survival. As revolution swept through Germany and the imperial government crumbled, loyal officers found themselves custodians of enormous wealth that could no longer serve its intended purpose. Rather than allow these treasures to fall into the hands of enemy forces or revolutionary governments, some chose to send them to the bottom of the sea, creating underwater burial chambers that have tantalized treasure hunters and historians for more than a century. The story begins in the autumn of 1918, when the German war effort was clearly approaching its end. The spring offensive had failed catastrophically. American troops were arriving in France by the hundreds of thousands, and the German army was in full retreat along the Western Front. The imperial government, which had financed the war through massive borrowing and currency manipulation, faced the prospect of total economic collapse as well as military defeat. In this desperate situation, preserving what remained of the national wealth became as important as continuing the fight. German financial authorities had been preparing for this moment since early 1918, when it became clear that victory was no longer possible. Secret protocols had been developed for evacuating gold reserves, important documents, and other valuable assets in the event of imminent collapse. Much of this planning focused on the Navy, which retained greater freedom of movement than the Army and possessed vessels capable of carrying large cargoes over long distances without detection. The German submarine fleet, in particular, offered unique possibilities for concealing and transporting treasure. U-boats had already demonstrated their ability to operate in enemy-controlled waters and to surface at pre-arranged locations for secret meetings with agents and collaborators. Several submarines had been converted for special cargo missions, with their torpedo compartments modified to carry diplomatic pouches, intelligence materials, and other high-value items that needed to be moved without risk of interception. The first confirmed reports of gold shipments aboard German submarines came from British intelligence services, which had been monitoring enemy radio traffic for evidence of unusual naval operations. In September 1918, code breakers detected references to what appeared to be precious metal cargoes being loaded aboard U-boats at Kiel and other German naval bases. The messages were heavily encrypted and often incomplete, but they suggested a systematic effort to evacuate valuable materials before Allied forces could seize them. These intelligence reports were initially treated with skepticism by British naval authorities, who assumed that they were probably dealing with disinformation or communications about conventional military supplies. However, when several German submarines were sunk or captured during the final weeks of the war, searches of the vessels revealed evidence that supported the treasure ship theory. Specially constructed storage compartments were found in areas normally used for torpedoes, and some submarines carried documentation suggesting that they had been assigned to secret missions unrelated to normal combat operations. The most intriguing evidence came from U-boat 157, which was sunk by British destroyers in the North Sea on October 20, 1918. When divers eventually reached the wreck years later, they discovered that the submarine's forward compartments had been completely reconfigured to create waterproof storage areas. While no gold was found in the wreck, the modifications suggested that the vessel had been prepared for carrying cargo that was more valuable and sensitive than conventional military supplies. Even more mysterious was the fate of U-boat 296, which disappeared without trace during the final week of the war. The submarine had departed from Kiel on November 4, 1918, carrying what German records described only as special materials for delivery to a secret destination. Radio contact was lost 2 days later, and despite extensive searches by both German and Allied forces, no trace of the vessel was ever found. The timing of its disappearance just days before the armistice took effect led many to speculate that it had been carrying some of the most important treasures of the German Empire. Surface ships were also suspected of carrying gold shipments during the war's final phase. The German battlecruiser Hindenburg, which was among the vessels that surrendered to the British fleet in November 1918, showed evidence of having been hastily modified to carry unusual cargo. British inspectors found that several of the ship's ammunition storage areas had been converted into secure compartments with reinforced locks and waterproof seals. While these compartments were empty when the ship was searched, their construction suggested that they had been designed to protect valuable materials from both enemy action and the corrosive effects of seawater. The mystery deepened when German naval records captured after the war revealed references to something called Operation Nibelung, apparently a secret program for evacuating imperial treasures in the event of defeat. The documents were fragmentary and often written in code, but they described a systematic effort to remove gold, jewels, and important documents from vulnerable locations and transport them to secure hiding places. Much of this material was apparently intended to be hidden rather than simply moved to safety, suggesting that German planners expected the occupation of their country to be lengthy and comprehensive. One of the most detailed accounts of Operation Nibelung came from Admiral Karl Dönitz, who would later become famous for his role in World War II submarine warfare. In his post-war memoirs, Dönitz described receiving orders in October 1918 to prepare selected submarines for special cargo missions that would be crucial to Germany's future. He was told that these missions were more important than conventional combat operations, and that the submarines assigned to them should avoid all unnecessary risks that might compromise their ability to complete their deliveries. According to Dönitz, the special cargo missions involved transporting not just gold and other precious materials, but also important documents and personnel who needed to be evacuated from Germany before Allied occupation forces arrived. Some submarines were ordered to proceed to neutral countries where their cargoes could be safely unloaded, while others were apparently instructed to sink their treasures in carefully marked locations where they could be recovered after the war ended and Germany had regained its independence. The challenge of recovering these hidden treasures was complicated by the chaos that accompanied Germany's collapse and the subsequent changes in government that followed the war. Many of the naval officers who had participated in Operation Nibelung were killed during the final battles or chose to commit suicide rather than face capture and interrogation. Those who survived often found themselves in prisoner of war camps or refugee settlements where they had little opportunity to return to the locations where treasures had been hidden. The post-war hyperinflation that destroyed the German economy also eliminated many of the financial institutions and record-keeping systems that might have provided clues about the missing gold. Banks failed, government archives were scattered, and many families lost everything in the economic collapse that followed the military defeat. In this environment, stories about hidden treasure began to take on a mythical quality, becoming part of the folklore of defeat rather than subjects for serious historical investigation. Nevertheless, several organized attempts were made during the 1920s and 1930s to locate and recover the lost treasures of the German Navy. Salvage companies used primitive diving equipment to search the wrecks of submarines and surface ships that had been sunk during the war's final weeks. These efforts were hampered by the limited technology available at the time and by the reluctance of German authorities to provide information that might help foreigners recover what they still considered to be German national property. The most ambitious treasure hunting expedition was organized in 1928 by a consortium of British and American investors who claimed to have acquired maps and documents that revealed the locations of several submarine treasure caches. The expedition spent 3 months searching the North Sea and Baltic waters, using sophisticated sonar equipment and experienced divers to investigate promising sites. While they recovered some artifacts and ship components, no significant treasure was found, and the expedition was eventually abandoned due to high costs and disappointing results. World War II created new complications for treasure hunters interested in German naval gold. The Nazi government was acutely aware of the legends surrounding the lost imperial treasures and conducted its own secret searches for the missing gold. German military archives from this period contain references to Operation Bernhard, which appears to have been a systematic effort to locate and recover treasure that had been hidden during the previous war. Some historians believe that the Nazis were partially successful in these efforts, recovering enough gold to help finance their early rearmament programs. The chaos of the Second Global Conflict also created new opportunities for the German Navy to hide additional treasures. As the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, German submarines were once again suspected of carrying gold and other valuables to secret hiding places. The similarities between the two situations led many treasure hunters to confuse evidence from different periods, making it even more difficult to separate fact from fiction in the stories about naval gold. Modern technology has made it possible to search for the lost treasures with far greater precision than was available to earlier generations of treasure hunters. Sophisticated sonar systems can now detect metallic objects buried in seabed sediments, while remotely operated vehicles can explore shipwrecks without putting human divers at risk. Several major expeditions have used these tools to investigate sites where German submarines and surface ships were known to have been sunk, hoping to find evidence of the legendary treasure shipments. One of the most promising discoveries occurred in 1994, when marine archaeologists investigating the wreck of U-boat 858 found evidence of cargo compartments that had been sealed with unusual care. The submarine had been sunk off the coast of Scotland in the final weeks of World War I, and the wreck showed signs of having been deliberately scuttled rather than destroyed by enemy action. When divers finally managed to penetrate the sealed compartments, they found not gold but important documents and technical drawings that provided new insights into German submarine technology. The absence of actual treasure in this and other investigated wrecks has led some historians to question whether the naval gold legends have any basis in reality. They argue that the stories may have originated as propaganda designed to boost German morale during the dark days of defeat, or as post-war myths created to explain the disappearance of wealth that had actually been lost to hyperinflation and economic collapse. According to this interpretation, the treasure submarines never existed except in the imagination of people who needed to believe that their defeat had not been total. However, other researchers point to the substantial documentary evidence that suggests Operation Nibelung was indeed a real program. German naval archives contain numerous references to special cargo missions and modified submarines that cannot be easily explained unless they were actually carrying valuable materials. The testimony of surviving naval officers, while often contradictory and incomplete, provides enough consistent details to suggest that some kind of treasure evacuation was attempted during the war's final months. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from analysis of German gold reserves and their mysterious disappearance during the period when the naval treasure missions were supposedly taking place. German financial records show that substantial quantities of gold simply vanished from official reserves between September and November 1918, with no adequate explanation for where these materials went. The amounts involved were enormous, representing a significant fraction of the empire's total precious metal holdings. The timing of these disappearances corresponds closely with the suspected treasure submarine missions, suggesting that at least some of the missing gold may indeed have been loaded aboard naval vessels for secret transport. The fact that much of this gold has never been accounted for, despite intensive post-war investigations by Allied financial experts, supports the theory that it may still be resting on the ocean floor in the cargo compartments of sunken U-boats. The political implications of the lost naval gold extend far beyond simple treasure hunting. If substantial quantities of German imperial wealth were indeed hidden during the war's final weeks, their recovery could have significant legal and diplomatic consequences. Questions of ownership would be extremely complex, involving the rights of the original German state, the various successor governments that followed, and the individuals or organizations that might eventually discover the treasure. International maritime law provides some guidance for such situations, but the unique circumstances of wartime treasure hiding create precedents that have never been fully tested in court. The age of the potential discoveries also raises questions about statutes of limitations and the rights of salvage companies versus national governments. These legal complexities help explain why some governments have been reluctant to provide full cooperation with treasure hunting expeditions, preferring to keep the question of the lost gold unresolved rather than risk opening complicated legal disputes. The enduring fascination with the Kaiser's lost gold reflects something deeper than simple greed or adventure seeking. The stories tap into fundamental questions about the nature of wealth, power, and historical justice. They suggest that even the mightiest empires can be reduced to desperate attempts to hide their treasures from the consequences of their actions. The image of proud German naval officers consigning their nation's gold to the depths rather than surrendering it to their enemies speaks to themes of honor, loyalty, and the tragic costs of war. Modern treasure hunters continue to search for the lost gold, using increasingly sophisticated technology and newly discovered historical documents to guide their efforts. Each expedition brings the possibility of a breakthrough discovery that could finally solve one of the Great War's most persistent mysteries. Yet even if the treasure is never found, the stories themselves serve an important historical purpose, reminding us that the end of the war was not a simple matter of victory and defeat, but a complex human drama involving choices that continued to reverberate long after the guns fell silent. In the end, the mystery of the Kaiser's lost gold may be less important for what it might reveal about hidden treasure than for what it tells us about the psychology of defeat and the lengths to which people will go to preserve something of value from the wreckage of their world. Whether the gold lies sleeping beneath the waves or was lost to more mundane causes, the legends that surround it continue to capture our imagination, offering glimpses into the final, desperate acts of an empire that refused to accept that its time had passed. In the gilded halls of the Palace of Versailles, where French kings had once held court and Napoleon had proclaimed his empire, the victorious powers of the Great War gathered in January 1919 to reshape the world. The setting was deliberately chosen to symbolize the reversal of German fortunes, for it was in this same palace that the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871 after Prussia's victory over France. Now the tables had turned, and it would be Germany's turn to suffer the humiliation of defeat in the very rooms where their ancestors had celebrated triumph. Yet beneath the pomp and ceremony of the Paris Peace Conference lay currents of ambition, revenge, and calculation that would create a settlement far more complex and problematic than the simple restoration of peace that war-weary populations desired. The men who gathered at Versailles were not just ending one war, but laying the foundations for the conflicts that would follow. Their decisions would redraw the map of Europe, create new nations, destroy old empires, and establish principles of international law that continue to influence world politics today. The mystery of Versailles lies not in what was decided, for the terms of the various treaties are well documented, but in the hidden motivations and secret agreements that shaped those decisions. Why did the victorious powers choose to impose such harsh terms on Germany, when many experts warned that excessive punishment would breed resentment and future conflict? What private understandings existed between the Allied leaders that were never committed to writing? And, perhaps most puzzling of all, did some participants deliberately design a peace settlement that would prove unstable, ensuring that the conflicts of the Great War would continue in different forms? The Big Four leaders who dominated the conference brought very different visions of what the post-war world should look like. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived in Paris as a prophet of democratic idealism, carrying his 14 points program for a just and lasting peace based on national self-determination and international cooperation. His vision of a world made safe for democracy inspired millions of people across the globe who hoped that the sacrifices of the war years would lead to a better future for all humanity. Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain approached the conference with the pragmatic eye of an experienced politician who understood that public opinion at home demanded both victory and revenge. British voters had just re-elected his coalition government on promises to make Germany pay for the war, but Lloyd George was also aware that Britain's long-term interests required a stable Europe where trade could flourish and threats to the empire could be contained. He faced the delicate task of satisfying domestic demands for punishment while avoiding a settlement so harsh that it would create permanent instability. Premier Georges Clemenceau of France came to Versailles with the burning memory of 2 German invasions within living memory and an absolute determination to ensure that Germany could never again threaten French security. The Tiger, as he was known, had witnessed the siege of Paris in 1870 and had seen the devastation that German armies had inflicted on northern France during the recent war. For Clemenceau, the conference was not about creating an ideal world, but about making certain that France would never again face the nightmare of German military power. Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando of Italy represented a nation that felt cheated by its wartime allies and was determined to secure the territorial gains that had been promised in return for entering the conflict. Italy's demands for Austrian territory along the Adriatic coast brought the principle of national self-determination into direct conflict with the realities of strategic geography and ethnic politics. Orlando's presence at the conference ensured that idealistic principles would be tested against the harsh realities of national ambition. The negotiations that unfolded over 6 months of intensive diplomacy were far more complex than the public presentation suggested. While newspapers reported on the formal sessions and ceremonial events, the real work of the conference took place in private meetings where the leaders could speak frankly about their concerns and objectives. These conversations were rarely recorded in detail, leaving historians to piece together the true dynamics of the peacemaking process from fragments of evidence and later recollections. One of the most significant mysteries of Versailles concerns the economic clauses that would burden Germany with reparations payments for decades to come. The final settlement required Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and to pay compensation for all civilian damage and military pensions, a sum that would eventually be calculated at $33 billion, an astronomical amount that represented more than 3 times Germany's entire annual economic output. The origins of these harsh financial terms have been the subject of intense historical debate. The public justification was that Germany should pay for the damage it had caused, but private correspondence between Allied leaders reveals more complex motivations. French officials saw reparations as a way to permanently weaken German economic power and prevent the reconstruction of German military strength. British negotiators viewed them as compensation for the enormous costs that Britain had incurred in financing the war effort. American representatives were more skeptical, but were ultimately persuaded to support the reparations principle as part of a broader package deal. What makes the reparations question particularly mysterious is evidence suggesting that some Allied leaders understood from the beginning that the payments were unrealistic and could never be fully collected. John Maynard Keynes, the brilliant British economist who served as an advisor to the peace conference, warned in detailed memoranda that the proposed reparations would destroy the German economy and undermine European recovery. His warnings were largely ignored, leading him to resign in protest and write a devastating critique of the settlement that became an international bestseller. The question that haunts historians is whether Keynes's warnings were genuinely overlooked or whether some negotiators actually wanted to create an economically weakened Germany regardless of the broader consequences. Secret communications between French officials suggest that they saw reparations not as genuine compensation, but as a tool for maintaining German weakness. The possibility that the economic clauses were deliberately designed to be destructive rather than reconstructive adds a sinister dimension to the peacemaking process. The territorial provisions of the Versailles settlement were equally controversial and equally mysterious in their ultimate purposes. The treaty stripped Germany of substantial territories in Europe and all of its overseas colonies, reducing the country's size by 13% and its population by 10%. The lost territories included important industrial regions like Alsace-Lorraine and the Saar Basin, as well as agricultural areas in the east that had fed the German population for centuries. The justification for these territorial changes was presented in terms of national self-determination and the rights of oppressed peoples to choose their own governments. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, the Saar was placed under international administration, and large parts of eastern Germany were transferred to the newly recreated state of Poland. Each of these changes could be defended in terms of ethnic justice and historical precedent, but their cumulative effect was to surround Germany with potentially hostile neighbors and to create new sources of international tension. The creation of the Polish Corridor, which gave Poland access to the sea by separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany, was particularly problematic. The corridor contained substantial German populations who had not been consulted about their transfer to Polish rule, violating the principle of self-determination that was supposed to guide the peace settlement. Allied negotiators were well aware of this contradiction, but decided that Polish independence required access to the sea, regardless of German objections. The mystery lies in whether the territorial arrangements were designed primarily to satisfy the legitimate aspirations of liberated peoples or to create a ring of allies around Germany that would prevent any future German resurgence. Secret agreements between France and the new states of Eastern Europe suggest that the territorial changes were part of a broader strategy to maintain French hegemony in Europe by surrounding Germany with French client states. The military clauses of the Versailles Treaty were equally revealing of hidden agendas and long-term strategies. Germany was forbidden to possess tanks, military aircraft, or submarines, and its army was limited to 100,000 men serving under long-term contracts that would prevent the development of a large reserve force. The German Navy was restricted to 6 battleships and a handful of smaller vessels, while the Air Force was completely prohibited. These restrictions were presented as necessary measures to prevent German aggression, but they also served the interests of the victorious powers in more subtle ways. The prohibition on German military aviation helped preserve the technological advantages that Britain and France had developed during the war. The naval limitations ensured that Germany could never again challenge British control of the seas. The restrictions on army size prevented Germany from developing the military expertise that might threaten French security. What makes these military clauses particularly mysterious is their relationship to the broader question of disarmament. Wilson's 14 points had called for the reduction of armaments to the lowest level consistent with domestic safety, implying that all nations would limit their military forces once the German threat was eliminated. However, the Versailles Treaty imposed restrictions only on Germany, while leaving the victorious powers free to maintain whatever military forces they deemed necessary. This asymmetry raises questions about whether the disarmament clauses were genuine efforts to promote peace or simply attempts to maintain the military dominance of the victorious powers. French military planners made no secret of their belief that German disarmament should be permanent rather than temporary, while British naval authorities were determined to prevent any revival of German naval competition. The possibility that disarmament was conceived as a unilateral rather than multilateral process suggests that some Allied leaders were more interested in maintaining their advantages than in creating a genuinely peaceful international system. The League of Nations, which was established as part of the peace settlement, represents another area where the idealistic public presentation may have concealed more pragmatic private calculations. Wilson presented the League as the cornerstone of a new international order based on collective security and peaceful resolution of disputes. The organization would provide a forum where nations could discuss their differences and work together to prevent future wars. However, the structure and membership of the League revealed significant limitations that raised questions about its true purposes. Germany was initially excluded from membership, as was the Soviet Union, meaning that 2 of the most important European powers were shut out of the organization that was supposed to maintain international peace. The United States, despite Wilson's leadership role in creating the League, ultimately refused to join due to domestic political opposition. The exclusion of major powers from the League suggests that it may have been conceived less as a universal peacekeeping organization than as a mechanism for the victorious powers to coordinate their policies and maintain their dominance. French leaders saw the League as a way to institutionalize the wartime alliance and ensure continued cooperation against any German revival. British officials viewed it as a useful forum for managing international disputes without resort to military force. The possibility that the League was designed to preserve the post-war settlement rather than to create genuine international cooperation adds another layer of complexity to the peace negotiations. The treatment of colonial questions at Versailles also reveals the gap between idealistic rhetoric and practical politics. Wilson's principle of self-determination was supposed to apply to all peoples seeking freedom from foreign domination, but the conference participants were careful to limit its application to European territories. German colonies were redistributed among the victorious powers under the mandate system, which provided a thin legal veneer for what was essentially traditional colonial annexation. The mandate system was presented as a progressive innovation that would prepare colonial territories for eventual independence under the guidance of more advanced nations. However, the practical effect was to transfer German colonies to Britain, France, and other Allied powers without any meaningful consultation with the indigenous populations. The contradiction between the principle of self-determination in Europe and the practice of colonial redistribution elsewhere suggests that the peace settlement was designed primarily to serve the interests of European powers, rather than to establish universal principles of justice. Private communications between colonial officials reveal that they understood the mandate system to be a convenient fiction that would allow them to exploit former German territories while maintaining a facade of international legitimacy. The possibility that colonial redistribution was motivated by economic opportunism rather than humanitarian concern adds yet another dimension to the hidden agendas that shaped the peace settlement. The immediate aftermath of the Versailles settlement provided clues about its ultimate effectiveness and the true intentions of its architects. The treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But the peace it established proved to be fragile and temporary. Germany's initial compliance with the treaty terms was grudging and incomplete, while the victorious powers struggled to maintain the unity that had sustained them during the war. The rapid breakdown of Allied cooperation suggests that some participants may have understood from the beginning that the Versailles settlement was unsustainable. French attempts to enforce the treaty strictly conflicted with British and American desires to restore normal economic relations with Germany. The result was a series of crises and confrontations that kept Europe in a state of tension and uncertainty for the next 2 decades. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Versailles is whether this instability was an unintended consequence of conflicting national interests or a deliberate feature of a settlement designed to prevent any single power from achieving dominance in Europe. Some historians have suggested that British leaders, in particular, may have preferred a weak and divided continent where Britain could play the role of balancer rather than face a unified European bloc that might challenge British global supremacy. The legacy of the Paris Peace Conference extends far beyond the specific terms of the treaties that were signed in 1919. The conference established precedents for international organization, principles of territorial settlement, and concepts of war guilt that would influence international relations for generations to come. It also demonstrated the difficulties of translating military victory into lasting political success and the dangers of imposing settlements that lack the genuine consent of the governed. As we reflect on the mysteries of Versailles from the perspective of more than a century later, we can see how the hidden agendas and secret calculations of 1919 contributed to the conflicts that followed. The peace that was supposed to end all wars became instead the foundation for new wars, as the unresolved tensions and contradictions of the settlement created the conditions for future conflicts. The men who gathered in the palace of the Sun King believed they were creating a new world order, but they may have been merely rearranging the pieces on a chessboard where the game would continue under different rules. As we reach the end of our journey through the mysteries of the Great War, we find ourselves standing in a landscape transformed not just by the passage of time, but by the questions that refuse to find their answers. More than a century has passed since the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, yet the shadows cast by those 4 terrible years continue to stretch across our understanding of history, politics, and human nature itself. The war that was supposed to end all wars instead became the foundation for conflicts that would define the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The mysteries we have explored together represent far more than simple historical puzzles or unsolved cases. They are windows into the deeper complexities of human experience during one of the most transformative periods in modern history. Each unexplained disappearance, each decoded message, each moment of unexpected humanity amid the machinery of destruction tells us something important about how ordinary people respond to extraordinary circumstances and how the fog of war creates spaces where truth becomes elusive and certainty dissolves into speculation. The vanishing of the Norfolk Regiment at Gallipoli reminds us that even in our age of documentation and bureaucracy, entire groups of people can disappear so completely that their fate becomes a matter of eternal debate. Whether those brave men from the Sandringham Company were swallowed by a mysterious cloud, overwhelmed by Turkish forces, or simply lost in the chaos of a badly planned attack, their story speaks to the fragility of human life and the ease with which individual experiences can be erased from the historical record. Their disappearance has become a symbol for all the losses that cannot be fully explained or adequately mourned. The mystery of HMS submarine E3 and her crew reveals how the new technologies of warfare created new ways to vanish without trace. The steel coffins that carried men beneath the waves offered both unprecedented offensive capabilities and unprecedented risks. When E3 disappeared into the depths of the North Sea, she joined a growing community of vessels that had been swallowed by an element that humans had only recently learned to navigate. Her eventual discovery decades later answered some questions but raised others. reminding us that even when we find the physical evidence of tragedy, the human stories behind that evidence often remain forever unknowable. The phantom airships that haunted British skies before the war began serve as a perfect example of how fear and uncertainty can create their own reality. Whether those mysterious vessels were German reconnaissance aircraft, natural phenomena, or products of collective imagination, they succeeded in preparing the British public for the aerial dimension of modern warfare that was about to be unleashed upon the world. The fact that we still cannot definitively explain what people saw in those pre-war skies suggests that some historical events exist in the borderland between fact and myth, where the truth may be less important than the meaning that people attach to their experiences. The Zimmerman telegram stands as perhaps the most consequential piece of intercepted communication in history, yet its story is filled with conveniences and coincidences that strain credibility. The fact that such a damaging message reached British intelligence at precisely the moment when American entry into the war was most desperately needed raises questions about the nature of intelligence operations and the role of deception in international relations. Whether the telegram was a genuine intelligence coup or a more complex operation involving multiple layers of manipulation, it demonstrates how information can be weaponized just as effectively as explosives or poison gas. The Christmas truce of 1914 offers perhaps the most hopeful mystery of the entire war, yet it is also the most heartbreaking. The spontaneous outbreak of peace that swept across portions of the Western Front showed that even in the midst of industrial slaughter, human beings retained their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. Yet the failure to sustain or repeat this miracle of human connection reveals the limitations of individual goodwill when confronted with the machinery of institutional violence. The soldiers who shared Christmas dinner in no man's land returned to their trenches knowing that they would soon be trying to kill the men they had just befriended, carrying with them a burden of moral complexity that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The mystery of the Paris gun represents the technological dimension of the Great War's puzzles, showing how the conflict pushed the boundaries of what was scientifically possible while creating weapons that seemed to belong more to science fiction than to contemporary warfare. The fact that such an enormous and sophisticated weapon could be built, deployed, and then vanish without trace speaks to the rapid pace of innovation during the war years and the effectiveness of military secrecy, even in an age of modern communications. The Paris gun reminds us that some of the most significant developments of the war may still be hidden in classified archives or lost forever in the chaos that accompanied the conflict's end. The legend of the Kaiser's lost naval gold touches on themes of treasure and adventure that have captivated human imagination for centuries, but it also reveals the desperate measures that failing empires will take to preserve something of value from the wreckage of their ambitions. Whether Operation Nibelung actually succeeded in hiding vast treasures beneath the waves of the North Sea, the stories themselves tell us something important about how people cope with defeat and loss. The possibility that fortunes in gold still rest in the cargo holds of sunken submarines serves as a metaphor for all the wealth and potential that was squandered during the years of destruction. The hidden agendas of the Versailles peace settlement show how victory can be just as morally complex as defeat. The gap between the idealistic rhetoric of the peacemakers and their practical calculations about power and advantage reveals that even those who claimed to be creating a better world were often motivated by narrow national interests and desire for revenge. The fact that some Allied leaders may have deliberately designed an unstable peace that would prevent German recovery while maintaining their own dominance suggests that the war's end was not really an end at all, but merely a transformation of conflict from military to political and economic forms. Together, these mysteries create a portrait of the Great War that is far more complex and ambiguous than the simple narrative of good versus evil that was promoted by wartime propaganda and maintained by many post-war histories. They remind us that every conflict involves human beings making difficult choices under impossible circumstances, often with incomplete information and competing loyalties that cannot be easily reconciled. The fact that so many aspects of the war remain mysterious more than a century later suggests that we may never fully understand what happened during those transformative years, or why reasonable people convinced themselves that such devastating conflict was necessary. The enduring power of these mysteries lies not in their potential solutions, but in the questions they continue to ask about the nature of warfare, truth, and human behavior under extreme stress. Each unexplained event forces us to confront the limitations of our knowledge and the complexity of historical causation. They remind us that history is not a collection of established facts, but an ongoing conversation between the past and the present, where new evidence can change our understanding and old certainties can be overturned by fresh perspectives. The Great War Mysteries also demonstrate the importance of preserving and examining primary sources, even when they seem to contradict official accounts or challenge accepted narratives. The letters, diaries, photographs, and documents that have allowed historians to piece together these puzzles are irreplaceable windows into experiences that might otherwise be lost forever. They remind us that every war produces not just casualties and destruction, but also stories that need to be told and remembered, even when those stories resist easy interpretation or comfortable conclusions. As we reflect on these enduring mysteries in our own time, when new conflicts create their own puzzles and uncertainties, we can see how the patterns established during the Great War continue to influence contemporary events. The role of intelligence and disinformation in shaping public opinion, the challenge of maintaining moral principles during times of crisis, the difficulty of creating lasting peace settlements that address the root causes of conflict, all of these issues that emerged during 1914 to 1918 remain relevant to our current struggles with war and peace. The technological dimensions of the Great War Mysteries also speak to contemporary concerns about the pace of innovation and the unintended consequences of new weapons systems. Just as the Paris gun pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible while creating new forms of terror for civilian populations, modern military technologies continue to evolve in ways that challenge traditional concepts of warfare and international law. The lessons learned from studying the mysteries of the first global industrial conflict may help us better understand and respond to the challenges posed by cyber warfare, autonomous weapons, and other emerging technologies. Perhaps most importantly, the human dimension of these mysteries reminds us that behind every historical event are individual people struggling to make sense of circumstances that often exceeded their understanding or control. The soldiers who disappeared at Gallipoli, the submariners who vanished beneath the North Sea, the civilians who saw strange lights in the sky, the intelligence officers who intercepted secret messages, the enemies who shared Christmas together in no man's land. All of these people were trying to navigate a world that had been turned upside down by forces beyond their comprehension. Their stories remind us that history is ultimately about human experience rather than abstract political or military developments. The mysteries they left behind are not just puzzles to be solved, but invitations to empathy and understanding. They ask us to imagine what it might have been like to face the choices and challenges that confronted ordinary people during extraordinary times. They encourage us to think about how we might behave under similar circumstances and what lessons we can learn from their experiences. The fact that many of these mysteries remain unsolved after more than a century of investigation should not be seen as a failure of historical scholarship, but as a testament to the complexity and richness of human experience. Some questions may never have definitive answers, and some stories may never be completely told. This uncertainty is not a bug in the historical record, but a feature that keeps the past alive and relevant to each new generation that encounters it. As we close our exploration of the Great War's enduring mysteries, we are reminded that the shadows cast by that conflict continue to shape our world in ways both obvious and subtle. The institutions, borders, and precedents established during and after the war still influence international relations more than a century later. The technological innovations developed for military purposes continue to shape civilian life in countless ways. Most importantly, the questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the costs of conflict that emerged during those 4 terrible years remain as relevant and urgent today as they were when the first shots were fired in August 1914. The mysteries we have explored together serve as bridges between past and present, connecting us to the experiences of people who lived through one of history's most transformative periods. They remind us that every age must grapple with its own versions of the fundamental questions about war and peace, truth and deception, individual conscience and collective action that were so dramatically highlighted during the Great War. By continuing to study and discuss these enduring puzzles, We honor the memory of those who lived and died during the conflict while preparing ourselves to face the challenges of our own time with greater wisdom and understanding. In the end, the greatest mystery of the Great War may be how such a catastrophic conflict could emerge from a civilization that prided itself on progress, rationality, and moral advancement. The fact that educated, cultured people could convince themselves that industrial slaughter was an acceptable means of settling political disputes continues to puzzle and disturb us more than a century later. Perhaps by continuing to examine the unanswered questions and unsolved puzzles of that conflict, we can better understand the fragility of peaceful civilization and the constant vigilance required to preserve it.